Barton Crowe didn't knock. He never did. The door of Blackstone Ranch's main house swung open so hard it cracked against the inner wall, and every man in the room flinched except Colton Hayes, who was already on his feet before the echo died. Barton walked in like he owned the floor beneath him, which he'd made clear on more than one occasion he intended to. 3 of his riders flanked him, hats on, hands near their belts, the universal language of men who've been told they don't need to ask for anything. "Pack her out," Barton said. He didn't look at Elara directly. He looked at Colton the way a man looks at a dog he's about to put down. "By sundown, or I burn the south fence line and call it an accident." He turned and walked back out the same way he came in. The door didn't close behind him. Nobody moved to close it. The wind off the valley came through and knocked a tin cup off the table, and it rolled across the floor and stopped at Elara's feet, and still nobody moved. That was the moment. Not the drought that came later. Not the night the riders came. It was that cup rolling across the floor, and the silence that followed, and the way Colton Hayes finally turned and looked at her not with apology, not with doubt but with something she hadn't expected from any man in Red Hollow Valley. He looked at her like the answer was already decided. If this story found you today, don't leave yet. Subscribe to this channel and follow Elara's story all the way to the end, because what she does next will change everything you think you know about who belongs where. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Elara Voss came to Red Hollow Valley with $43, a leather satchel full of hand-drawn diagrams, and a reputation that had already arrived before she did. Not a good one. The letter from her previous employer, a farming cooperative 2 counties east, had said she was difficult to manage and prone to unconventional solutions. What it didn't say, because men in that position rarely say such things plainly, was that she'd been right about nearly everything, and they'd hated her for it. The underground cistern she'd proposed would have saved their wheat operation during the dry season. They'd voted it down in April. By August, half their crop was gone, and 2 families had left the valley. She didn't gloat. She just packed her satchel and moved on. Red Hollow wasn't her first choice. It wasn't even her third. But the valley had water, or had once had it, before 20 years of poor land management and a string of drought seasons had reduced most of the creek beds to cracked mud and memory. She'd read about it in a territorial survey published 6 years prior, a document most people had used to line their wood stoves. Elara had read it 3 times and made notes in the margins. She arrived on a Tuesday in late September, when the light in the valley turned everything the color of old brass and cottonwood leaves rattled like loose tin. The stage let her off at the edge of town, with a trunk that was too heavy for one person to carry and no one offering to help. She didn't ask. She dragged one end across the dirt and rested when she needed to and kept moving. The first person she spoke to in Red Hollow was a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who ran the dry goods store and knew everything about everyone within a 12-mile radius. Agnes looked Elara over in the particular way that small-town women assess newcomers, not hostile, exactly but precise. Taking inventory. "You're the one Colton Hayes sent for," Agnes said. "I responded to an advertisement," Elara said. "I don't know that he sent for me specifically. He's had 4 men out here this month. None of them stayed past the first week." Agnes set a jar of dried beans on the counter with a thud. "What makes you different?" Elara thought about several answers and chose the honest one. "I don't know yet. Ask me in a month." Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she almost smiled. "Well, that's more honest than the last fellow who told me he could rope a steer blindfolded in a lightning storm." She wrote down a number on a scrap of paper and slid it across the counter. "That's what the room at the boarding house costs per week. Mrs. Linfield is strict about supper hours." Elara took the paper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Agnes said. "Blackstone Ranch isn't an easy place. Colton Hayes isn't an easy man." That was the most generous warning she would receive. Colton Hayes had inherited Blackstone Ranch at 26, when his father died of a fever that should have been treatable if anyone in the valley had been willing to ride 4 hours through a February storm to fetch a doctor. Nobody had. Colton had watched his father die in a bed that smelled of camphor and stubbornness, since something had hardened in him that winter that never entirely softened again. He ran the ranch the way a man runs something he's afraid of losing, tightly, quietly, without complaint, and with a level of exhaustion that he'd stopped noticing sometime around year 3. Cattle were good stock. The land was decent, if you knew how to work it. But the water situation had become critical in the last 2 seasons, and Colton was not a man who admitted things had become critical until they already were. He'd placed the advertisement reluctantly. His foreman, a laconic man named Dutch Ackerman, had talked him into it after the 3rd well failed. "You need somebody who knows water systems," Dutch had said. "That's not me. That's not any of us. Where am I going to find someone like that out here?" You place an ad and you wait. 4 respondents had come and gone. The first 2 had looked at the terrain and invented reasons they were needed elsewhere. The 3rd had spent 2 days drawing up plans that amounted to a more expensive version of what Colton already had, which was failing. The 4th had lasted 4 days before Barton Crowe's men rode the fence line at dawn, 3 mornings running, until the fellow decided the job wasn't worth the nerves. Colton hadn't told Elara about the 4th man when she arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning, having walked the 2 miles from town because the horse she'd hired turned up lame halfway. She came up the drive with her satchel over one shoulder and dust on her boots and no particular expression on her face, and Colton watched her from the porch with his coffee going cold in his hand and thought, "She's smaller than I expected." He'd learned quickly that this was the wrong thing to think about Elara Voss. "Mr. Hayes," she said, stopping at the base of the porch steps. "Miss Voss." He looked at the satchel. "That all you brought?" "My trunk's at the boarding house. I wanted to see the land before I moved anything out here." She shielded her eyes and looked south, toward where the main creek bed ran. Or had run. "That's the creek? What's left of it?" She was quiet for a moment. He watched her looking at it the way you'd watch someone read a letter, like she was getting information out of it that he couldn't see. "Can I walk it?" she asked now. "If you have time. Or I can go alone." He set down his coffee. "I'll come." They walked the creek bed for the better part of 2 hours, and in that time Elara spoke maybe 40 words, most of them questions. She picked up rocks and turned them over. She pressed her palm flat against the earth in 3 different places. She made notes in a small leather book with a pencil she kept behind her ear, the way some men kept a cigarette. Colton walked beside her and answered her questions, and did not ask what she was looking for, because he had the impression she would tell him when she was ready, and not a moment before. Dutch met them when they came back, leaning on the fence near the barn, with his arms crossed, and his expression neutral, which was Dutch's version of skeptical. "She find anything?" he asked Colton. "She hasn't said." Dutch looked at her. She was back at the satchel, pulling out a rolled diagram. "You figured something?" he asked. "Possibly," she said. She spread the diagram on the fence rail and weighted 2 corners with rocks. "There are mountain springs in this valley that haven't been mapped properly. The territorial survey touched on them, but whoever did the fieldwork was working fast and missed the secondary drainage pattern." She traced a line on the diagram with her finger. "If I'm reading the soil right, there's a water table running under this section of the property that nobody's tapped. It would require digging. Some structural work. It's not a small project." Dutch looked at Colton. The look said, "This sounds like what the last 3 said before they disappeared or gave up." Elara noticed. She rolled the diagram back up without comment. "I'm not promising anything yet," she said. "I'd need a week to verify the ground conditions before I'd say it was certain. I've been wrong before." That last sentence was the one that caught Colton off guard. Not because it was unusual to be wrong, but because in his experience, people who wanted to impress you didn't lead with their failures. "All right," he said. "You've got a week." The week was not peaceful. Word traveled in Red Hollow Valley the way bad news always travels, faster than anyone intended, and with embellishments that made the original barely recognizable. By Thursday, the story at the feed store was that Colton Hayes had hired a woman from back east who claimed she could find water with her bare hands. By Friday, it had reached Barton Crowe's ranch, which sat on the eastern ridge like a crow on a fence post, watching everything below it. Barton Crowe had been the largest landowner in the valley for 11 years, and he had managed to remain so through a combination of legitimate business practices and a flexible relationship with the concept of legitimacy. He bought land when ranchers went under. He managed water rights with a precision that left his neighbors perpetually a little short. He employed men who were good at riding fence lines slowly, in a way that reminded people they were being observed. He was not by most measures a villain in the theatrical sense. He was simply a man who had decided that his interests were the only interests worth considering, and who had sufficient resources to act on that belief. When his ranch manager told him about Elara Voss and her survey work, Barton had been quiet for a moment, in the way that men are quiet when they're calculating rather than listening. "Send somebody over to look," he said, casual, not threatening. Somebody he sent was a man named Reese, who showed up at the fence line of Blackstone Ranch on Friday afternoon with a friendly expression and a story about a stray heifer. Elara was in the south field when he rode past. She watched him the way she watched most things, calmly, and with more attention than she showed on her face. That evening she told Colton what she'd seen. "He wasn't looking for a heifer," she said. "No," Colton agreed. "Barton doesn't lose cattle. He counts them twice. Should I be worried?" Colton leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was a habit he had when he was about to say something he didn't entirely want to say. Barton doesn't like it when things change in this valley. He's comfortable with things the way they are, meaning he benefits from things the way they are. Yes, she thought about that. Then we'd better find out whether I'm right about that water table before he decides to make things complicated. She was right about the water table. On the 6th day, she and 2 of Colton's ranch hands dug test shafts in 3 locations she'd marked on her diagram. The 3rd shaft, dug in a low depression between 2 rock outcroppings in the east field, hit moisture at 11 feet and standing water at 14. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Jesse, barely 20, who'd been skeptical in the way that 20-year-old men are skeptical of anything suggested by a woman older than them, sat back on his heels and stared down into the dark water and said, very quietly, "How did you know?" "The rock formation," she said. "And the way the grass grew different over here. Different color. You have to look for what doesn't fit." Jesse looked at her then with an expression she'd seen before, not admiration exactly, but the calibration that happens when a person is forced to update a belief they were comfortable with. It wasn't flattering. It was real, and she preferred real. Colton came out when Jesse sent word, stood at the edge of the shaft and looked down and said nothing for a long time. "It's enough to work with?" he finally asked. "It's a start," she said. "The secondary springs connect to this table the way I think they do. And if we build the right kind of channel system, yes. It's enough. How long?" 6 weeks, maybe 8. Depending on the rock. He looked at her. In the slant of late afternoon light, his face showed the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from one hard day, but from a long succession of them. The tiredness of a man who'd been holding something heavy for years and had started to wonder if he'd ever be able to put it down. "All right," he said. "You haven't asked what it costs yet." "No. Don't you want to know?" He shook his head slowly. "If you're right about this, Miss Voss, and it looks like you are, then the cost of not doing it is already more than I can afford." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the ground and put it back on. "Draw up what you need." She moved her trunk out from Mrs. Linfield's boarding house the following Monday. This was, in retrospect, the event that made the situation real to Red Hollow Valley, in a way that the advertisement and the test shafts had not. A hired hand who stayed in town was one thing. A woman living on Colton Hayes' property was something the town's collective imagination could work with in a dozen unflattering ways, and it did. Margaret Hollis, the minister's wife, mentioned it at the quilting circle with what she described as concern. 3 ranchers brought it up with Colton directly, in the careful, indirect way that men approach topics they find both interesting and embarrassing. Dutch said nothing about it, which was its own kind of statement. Colton said the same thing to each of them. "She's doing a job. You have questions about the job, ask her." Nobody asked her. Elara heard the talk through the particular silence that descends when a woman walks into a room and conversations rearrange themselves. She was not unaccustomed to it. She had grown up in a household where her father had treated her intelligence as a practical asset, and her mother had quietly taught her that the world would not always agree and that this was information to be factored in rather than fought directly. She focused on the work. The channel system she was designing was more complicated than the initial test shaft had suggested. The mountain springs she'd identified in the survey needed to be connected to the underground table by a series of graded channels that would require careful calculation to function properly. Too steep, and the water moved too fast, carrying sediment too shallow, and it wouldn't move at all. She worked on the calculations at the kitchen table every evening after supper, by lamplight, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, the same way she'd worked on every problem she'd ever been given. Jesse started staying after the dinner hour to watch her work. He didn't ask questions at first. He just watched, in the way that young people watch things they're trying to understand. After 3 nights of this, she pushed one of the diagrams across the table toward him. "You're looking at it upside down," she said. He turned it around and looked at it right side up. "What's this line?" She explained it. He asked another question. She answered that one too. By the end of the second week, Jesse was helping her with the measurements during the day and asking genuinely useful questions in the evenings. He was not a quick study in the way that some people are quick. He needed to be told things more than once, and he had a habit of being confident about things he was wrong about, which she addressed directly each time it happened, which he initially found insulting and eventually found useful. Dutch watched this arrangement with his characteristic neutral expression. At the end of the second week, he came to Colton and said, "She's all right." Coming from Dutch, this was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. It was on a Thursday at the end of the third week that Barton Crowe made his first serious move. He didn't come himself. He sent his ranch manager, a man named Fowler, who wore his authority in his shoulders and spoke with the measured patience of someone who'd been told they were important enough times that they'd started to believe it. Fowler arrived at Blackstone Ranch at mid-morning with 2 riders and a document folded in thirds and sealed with wax that nobody in Red Hollow used anymore. Colton met him on the porch. Fowler handed him the document without a greeting. "Mr. Crowe's attorneys have reviewed the original land survey from 1871. There's a boundary discrepancy on your east field. Mr. Crowe believes that acreage belongs to his holdings." Colton unfolded the document and looked at it. "This is a copy." "Yes." "Where's the original?" "With Mr. Crowe's attorneys." Colton folded it back up. Elara had come to the door without either of them noticing, and now she stood just inside it, listening. "The east field," Colton said. His voice was even. "That's where we've been working." "Yes," Fowler said. "Mr. Crowe thought you should know before you put any more effort into it." There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that contains a great deal of information. "Tell Mr. Crowe I'll have my own attorney look at it," Colton said. "Of course." Fowler took the document back. Colton let him take it, which was a mistake, and Elara saw it happen and said nothing yet, because it wasn't the right moment. "Mr. Crowe hopes this can be resolved quietly." They rode back the way they came. Colton stood on the porch and watched them go until they were over the ridge, and then he came inside and sat down at the table and rubbed his face with both hands. "He's going after the east field," he said. "Yes," Elara said. "Because that's where the water is. That would be my reading of it." He looked up at her. "You knew he'd do something like this?" She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with the care she gave to measurements. "I knew he'd do something. I didn't know what shape it would take." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Can I seize the 1871 survey?" "Your copy." "I have it. Somewhere. Find it tonight. And whatever other land records you have going back to the original deed." She folded her hands on the table. "Boundary discrepancies in old surveys are real things. They're also very easy to manufacture if you have access to the right documents and the right attorneys. What matters is which version of the survey gets presented to a judge." Colton looked at her for a long moment. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before." "Not exactly this, but the shape of it." She met his eyes. "Mr. Hayes, what Barton Crowe is doing right now is telling you that this land, your land, is only yours if he allows it to be. And the document Fowler just took with him is the first piece of a story he's building." She paused. "We need to start building our own." He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass of the east field, the field above the water table, the field that was going to change everything if they could hold on to it. "All right," Colton said for the third time since she'd arrived. Each time he said it, she noticed it cost him something. He was not a man who trusted easily. Every all right was a piece of ground he was choosing to stand on with her rather than alone. She understood the weight of that. She didn't take it lightly. She went to find the land records, and the work of the real fight, the one that would take longer than digging any shaft and require more precision than any water channel, began that evening. By lamplight, with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of documents that somebody very powerful very much hoped she'd never get around to reading. The land records Colton had were a mess. Not because he was careless, he wasn't. Not about most things, but because the original deed to Blackstone Ranch had passed through 3 sets of hands before it reached his father, and each transfer had generated its own paperwork, its own annotations, its own layer of bureaucratic sediment that nobody had ever fully sorted through. The documents lived in a tin box under the floorboard in the study, wrapped in oilcloth that had done a reasonable job of keeping out the moisture, but nothing at all about the mice, who had sampled the corners of at least 4 documents that Elara could identify. She spread everything on the kitchen table and sorted it into piles, while Colton stood in the doorway, watching with an expression that suggested he found the whole business faintly humiliating, the way a person feels when a stranger sees the inside of a closet they've been meaning to organize for years. Some of these are water damaged, she said, not as an accusation. There was a roof leak in '79. Were you here? I was 12. She set aside the worst of the damaged ones and kept working. Dutch came in sometime around 9 o'clock, poured himself a cup of coffee without asking, and sat to the corner chair the way Dutch did everything, as if he'd always been there and wasn't planning to leave. He didn't offer to help. He also didn't leave, which amounted to the same thing. What are we looking for? He asked. The original survey boundary on the east field, Elara said, and any document that references the creek tributary running through it. Why the creek? Because if Barton Crowe is making a boundary claim, he's not doing it because he wants the dirt. He's doing it because he wants whatever the dirt sits over. She didn't look up from the documents, which means his attorneys already know about the water table. Or they've guessed. Dutch looked at Colton. How would they know? Reese, Colton said. He'd been quiet until now. When he came through last week with the story about the heifer, he wasn't looking at the cattle. Dutch set his coffee down slowly. He was looking at the test shafts. The spoil pile was visible from the fence line, Elara said. Fresh dirt. Not hard to figure out what it meant, if you knew what you were looking at. She turned over another document. And Barton Crowe employs people who know what they're looking at. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper being sorted and the wind outside doing its usual work against the eaves. It was past 10 when Elara found what she was looking for, a survey notation from 1869, 2 years before the document Fowler had referenced, that placed the eastern boundary of Blackstone Ranch along a natural landmark rather than a measured line. A flat-topped rock formation that the original surveyor had labeled in cramped handwriting as the Anvil Stones. She held the document up to the lamp. Mr. Hayes, where are the Anvil Stones? He came to look over her shoulder. She felt him still for a moment before he answered. Eastfield, about 40 yards from the 3rd test shaft. She set the paper down carefully. Then if this survey is valid, and if the Anvil Stones are where you say they are, Barton Crowe's boundary claim fails. His attorneys would have needed to find a later survey that overrides this one, or manufacture one. Can they do that? Manufacture one? She looked at him. People do things they shouldn't when they have enough to gain. She tapped the document with one finger. We need to get this to a land attorney, not someone local. The nearest territorial office is in Harmon. 2 days' ride. Then someone needs to ride to Harmon. Colton looked at the document and then at her. Can't leave the ranch right now. No, she agreed. But I can. He didn't say anything for a moment. Dutch looked at his coffee cup. Outside something moved in the barn, one of the horses shifting in its stall, the normal sounds of a working ranch at night. You'd go alone? Colton asked. I've gone places alone before. She began folding the document with careful hands, the way you handle something that matters. I'll take copies of everything relevant. The originals stay here, locked up somewhere better than a tin box under a floorboard. There's an iron safe in the study. Use it. Dutch made a sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed quickly. Colton gave him a look. She's right about the tin box, Dutch said, unapologetically. Elara left for Harmon on Friday morning before sunup with a saddlebag containing copied documents, the 1,869 survey folded in oilcloth inside her coat, and a horse named Clem that Colton had described as reliable and Dutch had described as opinionated. Clem turned out to be both. He had strong feelings about the pace of travel and expressed them through a variety of gaits that were not the one Elara requested. But he moved steadily once he understood she wasn't going to argue with him, and they reached Harmon by mid-afternoon of the second day without incident. The Territorial Land Office was a two-room affair on the main street, staffed by a clerk named Aldous who looked at the documents Elara produced with the particular expression of a man who does not like complications arriving at his desk on a Friday. "These would need to be verified against the official registry," he said. "I understand that. Can you do it today?" "Today is Friday." "I'm aware." Aldous looked at her over the tops of his glasses, and she looked back at him with the calm that came from having been looked at that way by men in positions of minor authority for most of her adult life. He looked away first. "I can pull the registry files this afternoon," he said. "But if there's a competing claim filed, it goes to the Territorial Land Court. I can't adjudicate that here." "I'm not asking you to adjudicate. I'm asking you to tell me whether a competing claim has been filed, and if so, when." He went into the back room. She waited standing, because the only chair was behind his desk, and he hadn't offered it. 40 minutes later, he came back with a ledger and a look on his face that told her something before he said anything. "There's a claim filed 6 weeks ago," he said, "on behalf of Crowe Holdings, citing a boundary survey dated 1873. Kept her face neutral. By whom was the 1873 survey conducted?" He looked at the ledger. "A surveyor named T.R. Grady, working under contract to the Territorial Commission." "Do you have the original survey document?" "A certified copy was filed with the claim." "I'd like to see it." He hesitated. She waited. He went back to the back room. When he returned, he was carrying a document that was significantly cleaner than anything that had been living in a tin box. At Blackstone Ranch, the paper was white, and the ink was dark, and the edges were uncreased in the way of a document that had not spent much time being handled. Elara looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she pointed to the bottom of the page. "Is that seal standard for a Territorial Commission survey?" Aldous bent over it. Looked again. "It's close," he said carefully. "Close," she repeated. He straightened up. He was not, she realized, a stupid man. He was a careful man who had, until this moment, been hoping this wasn't what it appeared to be. "I would need to compare it to confirmed documents from the same period," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "You would." She left him with copies of the 1869 survey and a written statement of the discrepancies she'd identified, signed and dated. She didn't know if it would be enough. She knew it was a start, and that starts were what you worked with when everything else was being arranged against you. She rode back to Red Hollow on Saturday and Sunday, arriving at Blackstone Ranch at dusk on Sunday with a sore back and the particular clarity of mind that comes from 2 days on horseback, with nothing to do but think. Things had changed while she was gone. She knew it before anyone told her, in the way that you can tell a room has been disturbed, even when everything appears to be in its proper place. Colton was on the porch when she rode in, which was not unusual, but the way he was standing was. Dutch was with him, and Jessie, and a woman Elara didn't recognize older, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had spent decades in weather, and came out the other side, looking like it knew something about endurance. "That's Marta Boone," Colton said, when Elara had handed Clem off to Jessie and come up to the porch. "She ranches over on the North Ridge. Her husband passed 2 years ago. She's been running the place herself." Elara looked at the woman. "What happened?" Marta answered before Colton could. "Barton Crowe served papers on my property yesterday. Boundary claim, same as yours. Cattle missing from the south pasture, which I can't prove is connected and which I believe absolutely is." Her voice was level in the way that people get when they've burned through the part of themselves that wanted to cry and come out the other side into something colder and more useful. "I heard you were dealing with something similar. Agnes Pruitt told me." "Agnes tells everyone everything," Colton said without real complaint. "In this case it was useful," Marta said, looking at Elara. "Are you the one who went to Harmon?" "Yes." "Did you find anything?" "Enough to know that what Barton Crowe filed 6 weeks ago may not hold up if somebody examines it carefully." Elara looked at Colton. "He's not just going after us. He's clearing the field." Colton's jaw tightened. "How many others?" "I don't know yet. But if he served Marta yesterday and filed our claim 6 weeks ago," she stopped, worked through the timeline in her head. "He planned this before I arrived. Before the test shafts. He'd already identified the water table." "How?" Dutch asked. "He's been in this valley 11 years. He knows the land." She turned back to Marta. Do you have your original land documents? Some. My husband kept better records than most. Bring everything you have. I want to see if there's a pattern to which properties he's targeting. Marta looked at her for a moment, the look of a woman who is assessing whether another woman can be trusted with something that matters. It was a different kind of assessment than the one Agnes Pruitt had made, or the townspeople at the quilting circle. This one was practical, professional almost. All right, Marta said. They worked through most of Monday at the kitchen table, Elara and Marta, sides by side with their respective documents, while Colton and Dutch handled the ranch work, and Jessie ran between them and the field with messages and coffee that was never quite hot by the time it arrived. It was unglamorous work, the kind of work that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. Two women sitting at a table with papers, while the real work happens elsewhere. Pattern emerged by early afternoon. Barton Crowe's claims targeted 3 properties, all on the eastern edge of the valley. All 3 shared one characteristic. They bordered, or came close to, the natural drainage system that fed down from the mountain springs Elara had identified in the territorial survey. The properties formed a rough arc around the main underground water table, not randomly chosen, not opportunistic, mapped deliberately, over time, by someone who understood what they were looking at. He's been planning this for years, Marta said. She wasn't shocked. She said it the way you say something you've suspected and are now watching confirmed. At least since the drought started making water a genuine scarcity, Elara said. Maybe longer. Who's the third property? A family named Calloway. They have a homestead claim on the south section near the second spring I marked. She tapped the map. I don't know them. Eb Calloway, Marta said. Old man 70s. His son helps him work it. Good people. She paused. They won't have legal resources. They barely have enough to get through winters. Elara was quiet for a moment. Colton came in from outside and looked at the table and at their faces. You found something. We found the shape of it, Elara said. She turned the map toward him. It's not a boundary dispute. Consolidation. He wants to control the water sources on this side of the valley. All of them. Once he has the legal claims on these 3 properties, he controls the water access for every ranch within 6 miles. Colton looked at the map for a long time. Every ranch, including his competitors. Every ranch, period. She looked up at him. He doesn't need to beat you in a drought. He just needs to own the water when one comes. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and somewhere on the ridge, a hawk made a sound like something being torn in half. What do we do? Dutch asked. We go to the Calloways, Elara said. We show them what we found, and then we take all of it, every document, every survey, every piece of paper from all 3 properties, and we build a case that's too complicated to bury. She folded her hands on the table. Individually, Barton Crowe can handle each of us. He has better attorneys and more money, and he's already had 6 weeks head start on the legal process. And together? Marta asked. Together we're a pattern. Judges notice patterns. The ride to the Calloway homestead took most of Tuesday morning. Elara went with Colton, which was a decision that caused some comment in the bunkhouse among the 2 older hands, who had formed an opinion about the appropriate role of women in ranch business. She heard them talking through the wall of the barn while she was saddling Clem and chose not to address it directly, which was harder than it sounded and which she managed by focusing on the buckle of the left stirrup with more attention than it required. Colton said something to the men, quiet enough that she couldn't make it out. Whatever it was, the talking stopped. They rode most of the way in silence, the comfortable kind that takes time to develop between 2 people, and that neither of them remarked on. The valley spread out below the trail, the dry creek beds, the struggling cattle grass, the brown and silver of land that had given what it could and was now waiting. Elara looked at it and thought, as she often did, about what it could be with the right water. What it could look like in 5 years, 10 years, if the channel system held and the springs proved as reliable as her calculations suggested. Then she thought about Barton Crowe's map and felt the cold clarity of what was at stake. Were you always good at this? Colton asked. It came out of nowhere, the way questions do when someone has been working up to them for a while. She glanced at him. At which part? The reading of things. Land people. She thought about how to answer that honestly. My father surveyed land for a living. I spent summers with him when I was young. You learn to read what the ground is telling you. She paused. People aren't that different, actually. You look for what doesn't fit. What's been changed? What someone's trying to make you look past. Is that what you did with me? You weren't that complicated, she said, and there was enough dryness in it that he understood it wasn't an insult. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It startled them both slightly. She'd noticed, a laugh he'd mostly stopped using. The way you stop using a tool you've put away and half forgotten. What did you see? He asked. When you first got here. Considered it seriously. A man who was more tired than he knew. Who was used to handling everything alone and had convinced himself that was just how things were. She looked ahead at the trail, and who was practical enough that if something worked, he'd use it, even if it wasn't what he expected. He was quiet for a moment. That's generous. It's accurate, she said. Eb Calloway was 73 years old and looked like a man who had fought every year of it and won on points, if not on appearance. He met them at the gate of his homestead with a rifle that he didn't point at them, but didn't put down either. And his son Thomas stood a few paces behind him, with an expression that suggested he'd been fielding trouble for long, enough that he'd stopped trying to distinguish it from visitors before the situation clarified itself. Colton introduced himself. Eb knew who he was. Everybody in the valley knew everybody. That was the nature of the place. He looked at Elara with undisguised curiosity. You're the one working the water system, he said. Yes, she said. Agnes Pruitt says you found water under the east field. Agnes is accurate as a rule. Eb lowered the rifle and leaned on it like a walking stick. What do you want? Colton let Elara answer, which she noticed and which cost him something. His instinct was clearly to handle this himself, and she answered directly, without preamble, because Eb Calloway struck her as a man who would respond better to plain speech than to careful introduction. Barton Crowe has filed or is about to file a boundary claim on your south section, she said. He's done the same to us and to Marta Boone on the North Ridge. We think we know why, and we think if the three properties work together on the legal response, we have a better chance of stopping him than any of us do alone. Eb didn't react immediately. He looked at her, then at Colton, then back at her. Has he served papers yet? Thomas asked. Not to you specifically, as far as we know. But we believe it's coming. She looked at him. If you wait until the papers arrive, you lose time you don't have. The territorial court dates book out months in advance. Thomas looked at his father. Eb was quiet in the manner of a man who is not slow. He was turning it over, checking it for flaws, the way you check a load-bearing beam before you trust your weight to it. What do you need from us? Eb asked. Your original land grant and any survey documents you have, and your written statement that you've been operating this homestead continuously since the grant date. She reached into the saddlebag and pulled out the copy of the 1,869 survey she'd brought. I want to see whether the landmark references in your grant match what we found at Blackstone. If they do, we have 3 independent documents, all pointing to the same original boundary, and 1 document that Crowe's attorneys filed recently that contradicts all 3. Ebe looked at the survey in her hand. Something moved across his face, not hope exactly, because hope is a thing you have to be careful with when you've been in the valley as long as he had. More like the recalibration of odds, the cautious, unwilling sense that something might actually be possible. Come inside, he said. Thomas moved to take their horses. Colton dismounted and looked at Elara across the horses' backs, and she gave him a small nod that meant nothing specific and everything necessary. He nodded back. They were inside the Calloway homestead for 3 hours. Eb's records were better than Colton's had been, and not as good as Marta's. His original land grant was intact, faded but legible, with a territorial seal that Elara examined carefully. His survey reference points matched the 1,869 document at 4 out of 5 landmark notations, with the 5th being a tree that had likely died in the intervening decades and been removed. Close enough to be useful, close enough to matter. Thomas, who turned out to be quiet but precise, had kept a journal of ranch operations going back 8 years. Dates of water use, cattle movements, fence repairs, the kind of meticulous, unglamorous record-keeping that becomes invaluable when someone tries to claim you haven't been where you've been. This journal, Elara said, turning pages with the careful attention she gave to things that were more important than they looked. Would you be willing to have it copied and included in a joint filing? Thomas looked at his father. What exactly are we filing? Eb asked. A formal challenge to any boundary claim that contradicts the 1,869 survey, she said, filed jointly by 3 property owners with consistent historical documentation, supported by evidence of a potentially irregular survey document filed by Crowe Holdings. She set the journal down. I can't promise it succeeds. I can tell you that alone, each of us is manageable for a man with Barton Crowe's resources. Together, we're a problem that's considerably harder to make disappear quietly. Ebb was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pressed against the window glass, and one of the horses in the yard shifted and blew. My father homesteaded this land, he said, not to anyone in particular. 40 years ago, he broke the ground himself. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who'd done the same for 40 years more. I'm not inclined to hand it to Barton Crowe because he found a piece of paper with the right seal on it. Good, Elara said. What's our next step? We go back to Harmon, all of us, or representatives of all 3 properties. We request a formal registry review and file our joint challenge before Crowe's claim can move to the next stage. She looked at Colton. Can you get to Harmon by Thursday? If we leave tomorrow. Then we leave tomorrow. Marta was at Blackstone when they got back. She'd brought 2 of her own hands with her, and a pot of something that smelled like it had been cooking since morning, which was exactly the kind of thing nobody had asked for and everyone needed. She and Elara talked for an hour after supper, sitting at the table while Colton and Dutch went over the following day's logistics with the quiet efficiency of men who had been working together long enough to require very few words. You've done this before, Marta said. It wasn't quite a question. Not exactly this. Elara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I've dealt with people who use paper to take things from other people. Paper changes. The shape of it doesn't. Where are you from? Originally, Kansas. Before that, Ohio. She paused. I've moved a fair amount. Because of work? Because of work, and because of the particular experience of being useful to people until it becomes inconvenient for them. She said it without bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of a thing that had been true. Eventually you find somewhere the usefulness outlasts the inconvenience. Marta looked at her steadily. Is that what this is? Elara thought about that, about the test shaft in the east field, and the lamplight evenings with the diagrams, and Jesse turning the paper right side up, about Colton saying all right in a voice that cost him something each time. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Marta nodded, the way she nodded, which was like a period at the end of a sentence, complete and final. For what it's worth, she said, I've been in this valley 14 years. I've never seen anyone come in and read Barton Crowe the way you've read him inside of a month. I haven't beaten him yet. No, Marta said, but you know what shape he is. That's the part most people miss. She picked up her cup. That's the part that matters. They left for Harmon before dawn on Wednesday. Colton and Elara for Blackstone. Marta riding separately from the North Ridge. Thomas Calloway with his father's documents and his 8 years of journals packed in a leather case behind his saddle. 4 riders heading east as the sky went from black to gray to the pale yellow of early morning on the frontier, the kind of light that makes everything look temporary and necessary at the same time. Elara rode beside Colton and thought about the water table under the east field and the channel system she'd drawn and redrawn 6 times, and the document she'd found in Aldis's back room with the seal that was close but not quite right. She thought about what they were riding toward and what they were riding away from, and she thought, with the particular clear-eyed calculus of someone who has made a habit of assessing odds, about whether this was a fight they could win. She thought it might be. She thought it was also possible it wasn't. She kept riding. The valley spread out behind them as they climbed toward the eastern ridge, the dry creek beds, the brown grass, the struggling land. And somewhere beneath it, in the dark and the silence and the geological patience of water that had been moving through the rock, for longer than any of them had been alive, the springs ran on. They always had. The question was who they would belong to when the court made its ruling, and whether the answer would be the right one. And whether right, in Red Hollow Valley in the drought year of that decade, would be enough. Elara pulled her coat tighter against the morning cold and kept her eyes on the road. Aldis was waiting for them. That was the first thing Elara noticed when they reached the Territorial Land Office in Harmon. The clerk was standing outside the door rather than behind his desk, which was not the behavior of a man who had spent the previous 3 days doing nothing in particular. He had his coat on, despite the mild weather, and his hands were folded in front of him with the careful stillness of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. Elara read all of this in the time it took her to dismount. "Miss Voss," he said. Then Mr. Hayes. He looked at Marta and Thomas with the slight hesitation of someone cataloging unexpected variables. "I wasn't expecting." "No," Elara said. "I don't imagine you were. Can we go inside?" He held the door. They filed in, all four of them, which made the two-room office feel considerably smaller than it had on Elara's first visit. Thomas set his leather case on the nearest flat surface, with the deliberateness of a man who'd been carrying it for 2 days and was not going to put it down somewhere inconvenient. Aldous went behind his desk and stood there, which people do when they want the desk between themselves in a situation. "There's been a development," he said. "Tell me," Elara said. He opened the top drawer and produced a letter which he set on the desk but didn't push toward her. "2 days after your visit, I received correspondence from the Office of Territorial Land Commissioner regarding the Crowe Holdings filing." He paused. "They've moved to expedite." The room was quiet. "Expedite," Colton said. His voice was flat. "What does that mean specifically?" "It means the claim has been assigned a hearing date." Aldous looked at the letter, then at them. 4 weeks from Friday." Marta made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Thomas's hand went still on his leather case. Elara looked at Aldous. "On whose recommendation was it expedited?" "The commissioner's office didn't specify." "No," she said. "They wouldn't." She thought about this for a moment, not in a spiral, just the straight line of cause and effect that had been there from the beginning and was now simply moving faster than she'd planned for. "What is the process for filing a challenge to a claim that has been expedited?" "The same process. But the timeline compresses accordingly," she finished. "Yes, I understand." She looked at Colton, then back at Aldous. "We need to file today. All 3 challenges, as a joint submission, with a consolidated evidentiary statement." Aldous blinked. "I'm not certain the office has a standard form for." "Then we'll write it ourselves, and you'll certify the filing." She said it without heat, simply as the next logical step. "Mr. Aldous, I found a problem with that survey document last time I was here." "You saw it too." The seal, he was quiet. "If that document is fraudulent," she said, "and a hearing proceeds on the basis of it, and the fraud is discovered later, that is a problem for this office, as well as for the claimants. It is considerably better for everyone involved, including you, if the irregularity is formally noted in the record before the hearing rather than after." Aldous looked at the letter on his desk. He looked at the 4 people standing on the other side of it. He was a careful man. She had decided not a cowardly one, but careful, which was different, and which meant he needed to see the full picture before he moved. She showed him the full picture. She laid out the 1,869 survey, Marta's land grant, the Callaway homestead documents, and Thomas's journals in the order that told the clearest story. She walked Aldous through each document the way she'd walked Jesse through the irrigation diagrams, not condescending, not rushing, just the clean line of evidence from beginning to conclusion. The anvil stones, the matching landmark references, the 3 independent documents spread across 4 decades that all agreed with each other, and none of which agreed with what Crowe Holdings had filed. When she finished, Aldous sat down. It was the first time she'd seen him sit. "I'll need to pull the comparison documents from 1,873, he said. "Original commission surveys from that period to verify the seal." "Yes," she said, "that will take time." "You have until this afternoon." She said it gently, but she said it. "We can't leave Harmon without this filed. If we go back to Red Hollow without a formal challenge on record, Barton Crowe has 4 weeks and no opposition, and whatever friends he has in the commissioner's office working on his behalf." Aldous looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood back up and went into the back room. Colton moved to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. It took until 4 in the afternoon. Aldous pulled 12 survey documents from the 1870s and compared the commission seal on each one against the seal on the Crowe Holdings filing. He worked slowly and without comment, and Elara let him work, because this was the part where hurrying was the wrong strategy. Marta sat in the corner with her arms folded and her eyes open, which was how Marta waited for things. Thomas read his own journals, checking dates against the documents, a practical man doing practical work. Colton stood at the window and looked out at the street for the first hour, and then sat down and looked at the floor, which was an improvement in the sense that it suggested he'd stopped expecting something to happen outside. At 3:30, Aldous came out of the back room. "The seal is wrong," he said. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he'd been hoping not to make flat, final, with the weight of what it meant settling into the room. The 1,873 commission surveys use a different die stamp than what's on Sucro filing. The impression is close, but the inner ring measurement is off. Whoever made this document either used an old stamp that predates the 1,873 commission standard, or they made one themselves that wasn't accurate. Thomas let out a long breath. "Can you certify that finding?" Elara asked. "I can document it in the registry notes. For a formal certification, it would need to go to the commission examiner. Document it in the registry notes today. We'll use that as the basis for the joint filing and request an examiner's review as part of the challenge." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Aldous, you've done the right thing here." He didn't look particularly comforted by this. He looked like a man who'd stepped into a stream and was now calculating how deep it got. But he sat down at his desk and began to write, and that was what mattered. They filed at 4:45. All three challenges, consolidated, with Aldous's registry notation attached, and a formal request for postponement of the hearing pending commission examiner review of the survey document's authenticity. Aldous signed it. Elara signed it as representative of Blackstone Ranch at Colton's direction. Marta signed for her property. Thomas signed for the Calloway homestead with a letter of authorization from his father that Ebb had written out in his large, deliberate handwriting, and that contained, at the end, a sentence that had nothing to do with legal process. "I have lived on this land since 1861, and I intend to die on it, and not before." Elara read that sentence twice. They left Harmon as the sun was going down, with certified copies of the filing in the saddlebags, and the particular exhausted quiet of people who have done what they could, and now have to wait for the world to respond. The world responded in 9 days. Not the court. Not yet the court moved at its own pace, which was geological. What responded first was Barton Crowe. He didn't send Fowler this time. He came himself. Elara was in the east field with Jessie when she saw the riders on the ridge. 3 men, then a 4th, coming down from the eastern approach at a deliberate pace that was calibrated to be noticed. She shielded her eyes and counted them, and then went back to what she was doing, which was checking the grade on the first section of the channel they'd begun laying out the previous week. The work had continued, because stopping the work was not something she was willing to do, and because the East Field was still legally Blackstone land until a court said otherwise. Jesse saw the riders too. He stopped what he was doing and watched them, with the tight-shouldered wariness of a young man who'd grown up understanding that groups of riders approaching at that pace generally meant something unpleasant. "Keep working," Elara said without looking up. "Miss Voss," Jessie. She marked a measurement in her notebook. "If we stop every time someone rides a fence line, we'll never finish the channel. Keep working." He kept working, but his eyes went back to the ridge twice more before the riders reached the flat ground. Colton met them at the gate. Elara watched from the field. As Barton Crowe dismounted, she recognized him from the description Agnes had given her, which had been accurate. A large man, well-dressed for the frontier context, with the posture of someone who had not had to ask for anything in a very long time. He spoke to Colton. Colton listened. The conversation lasted perhaps 3 minutes, after which Crowe remounted, and the 4 riders went back the way they came, at the same deliberate pace. Colton came across the field toward her. "Well?" she asked. He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, which she'd learned was what he did when he was angry, and not letting it show in his face. "He says the filing is a nuisance." His word. "He says the commissioner's office will sort it out, and the hearings proceeds on schedule, and there's no legal basis for a delay." "He might be right about the last part," she said. "I know. But he came himself." She looked back at where the riders had disappeared over the ridge. He didn't need to do that. Fowler could have delivered a message. Colton looked at her. "You think that matters?" "I think men like Barton Crowe don't spend their own time on problems they consider solved." She turned back to the channel grade. "Came because he's not entirely sure how this resolves. That's useful information." Colton put his hat back on. He stood there for a moment, watching her make a mark in the notebook. You're going to keep building the channel. Yes. While we wait for the court. The court will take months, minimum. Even with the postponement request, even with the examiner review these things, move slowly. She looked up at him. Do you want water in this valley or not? He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had come to recognize not quite exasperation, not quite admiration, something that lived in the territory between the two. You're not an easy person, Miss Voss. No, she agreed. But I'm here. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. Keep going. Dutch pulled her aside that evening. He caught her coming in from the field at dusk, when the light was going amber and the shadows were getting long, and he fell into step beside her with the air of a man who had been waiting for a moment that was not in front of other people. You know he's not going to let the court thing sit, Dutch said. He meant Crowe. He didn't use the name, because with Dutch context was enough. Filing the challenge annoyed him. But getting the examiner involved, that's a different matter. Yes, she said. He has people in this valley who will act for him if he asks them to. She kept walking. I know. I'm not sure you know what that means, specifically. She stopped and looked at him. Dutch was not a man who said things for the drama of them. He said things because they were true and needed to be said, and this was one of those moments. Tell me what you mean specifically. He was quiet for a beat, choosing words with the economy of a man who used few and meant all of them. There's a fellow named Willett who drinks at the saloon most evenings. He does odd jobs for Crowe's outfit. Last night he was asking questions about the channel work. Who's doing it? How far along it is? What would happen if the survey stakes were pulled? Elara absorbed this. He was asking in earshot of you? He was asking in earshot of Jessie. Jessie told me. She looked out across the darkening field. The survey stakes were driven in at 12-foot intervals along the first section, small, easy to miss, absolutely essential. If someone pulled them in the night, they'd lose 2 weeks of grade work and have to resurvey the entire section from the baseline. We need to watch the field at night, she said. I can put the hands on rotation. Jessie included? Dutch looked at her sideways. You trust him with that? He told you about Willett, she said. He didn't have to. She turned toward the house. Yes, Jessie included, but not alone. Pair him with someone who's been doing this longer. Dutch nodded. That was settled. Dutch. She stopped. Thank you for telling me. He made the sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal. Ranch works better when things don't get burned down, he said, and walked off toward the barn. It was the closest thing to a declaration of solidarity she'd heard from him, and she understood that it cost him approximately nothing and meant considerably more than that. The survey stakes were not pulled that night or the next. On the third night, Jessie, who was on rotation with an older hand named Cutter from midnight to 3, heard horses on the south side of the east field, not on the road, but moving through the brush parallel to the fence line, the slow, careful movement of animals being ridden quietly. Jessie woke Cutter. Cutter woke Dutch. Dutch woke Colton. By the time they reached the south fence, the horses were gone. But in the morning, Elara found 3 of the survey stakes had been shifted, not pulled, shifted. 2 inches in one direction at the 3rd marker, 1 inch at the 7th, nothing at the others. Precise enough to be deliberate, subtle enough to be denied. She found it because she measured every stake against the baseline string before she began work each morning, which was a habit she'd developed not from paranoia, but from basic professional practice. Jessie was with her when she found it, and she watched his face go through the specific sequence of a young man realizing that someone had tried to undermine something he'd helped build. How did they know which stakes to move, he asked. They probably didn't, precisely. They may have moved more and hoped I wouldn't check them all. She reset the 3rd marker with careful hands. Or they knew exactly what they were doing. Either way, the answer is the same. What's the answer? We document it. She pulled out her notebook and recorded the discrepancy date, which marker, precise measurement of the shift, the baseline the marker had been set against. Then she reset it. Write down what you saw last night. The time you heard the horses. What direction they came from. What direction they left. Every detail. Will it help? I don't know yet, she said. But it's in the record. That matters. Jessie wrote it down. His handwriting was not refined, but it was legible and it was thorough. And she told him so, which was not something she would have thought to do a month ago, and which she noticed she did now without thinking about it. The postponement came through 12 days after they filed. Not a full postponement, the hearing date would stand, but the commission examiner would review the survey document before the hearing, and the findings would be entered into the record. This was less than Elara had hoped for, and more than she'd expected, which was roughly the ratio she'd learned to work with in legal matters. She received the news via letter delivered to the ranch by a rider from Harmon, and she read it twice in and then went back to the channel grade she'd been measuring. Colton found her there an hour later. "You don't look like someone who just got good news," he said. "It's partial news. The examiner review is good. The hearing date standing is not." She handed him the letter. "It means we have to be ready to present everything at the hearing itself, in 4 weeks, whether the examiner has issued findings by then or not." He read it. "Can we be ready?" "We have to be." She turned back to the grade, "Which means the channel work continues, the documentation continues, and I need to write the formal evidentiary argument for the hearing." She paused. "I also need to find an attorney. The clerk's certification is useful, but a hearing before a territorial judge requires representation. I know one in Harmon, name's Pierce. He handled a title dispute for me 3 years ago. Is he good?" Colton considered this with the honesty she'd come to rely on from him. "He's careful, methodical. He's not a man who takes cases he can't win. Then we need to make sure he thinks he can win this one." She turned to look at him. "Set up a meeting. Sooner is better." The meeting with Pierce happened 5 days later in the back room of his office in Harmon, which smelled of paper and something that might have been pipe tobacco from a decade ago, absorbed permanently into the walls. Pierce himself was a small man, 50s, with a kind of tidy mustache that signals attention to detail, and he listened to Elara's presentation of the evidence, with his hands folded on the desk and an expression that gave nothing away for the first 20 minutes. Then she laid out the sealed survey comparison, with Aldis's registry notation. He leaned forward. "Where did you find the 1,869 survey?" he asked. "In a tin box under a floorboard," she said. "In considerably better condition than you'd expect." He almost smiled. "And the seal discrepancy, Aldis documented this himself?" He did, voluntarily, once he understood what he was looking at. Pierce sat back. He looked at the documents arranged on his desk with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "This is not a simple boundary dispute," he said. "No," she said. "If the survey document is fraudulent, this is fraud on the Territorial Land Commission. That is a federal matter." "Yes." "Have you considered going to the federal level rather than the territorial court?" Elara looked at Colton. He looked back at her. They had not explicitly considered this, or rather, she had considered it and set it aside because the federal process was slower and less certain, and because she hadn't yet established the fraud firmly enough to bring it to federal attention without risk of it being dismissed at the threshold. Territorial court hearing gives us an opportunity to establish the evidentiary record in a formal proceeding, she said. If the examiner's findings support the seal discrepancy, and if we can present the consolidated documentation from all 3 properties, the territorial judge may refer it upward himself. Pierce looked at her for a moment. "You've done this kind of work before. Not law. Adjacent to it." He looked at Colton. "Where did you find her?" "She answered an advertisement," Colton said. Pierce looked back at his desk. "I'll take the case. All 3 properties, consolidated same rate for each." He named a figure that made Colton's jaw tighten, which was exactly what an honest rate did to a man who'd been careful with money for 20 years out of necessity. The rate accounts for the complexity. If we win, and I believe we can, there may be grounds for recovery of legal costs from the opposing party. "Maybe," Colton said. "Law is imprecise," Pierce agreed pleasantly. 3 weeks before the hearing, Barton Crowe made the move that changed the shape of everything. Elara found out about it on a Tuesday morning when Agnes Pruitt appeared at the door of Blackstone Ranch at 7 o'clock. Agnes, who lived in town and had no reason to be at the ranch, and whose presence therefore announced itself as news before she opened her mouth. Colton let her in. Dutch produced coffee. Agnes sat at the kitchen table with the particular composure of someone carrying information they know will have weight and have been considering how to deliver it since before dawn. "Barton Crowe has purchased the Hendricks property," she said. Elara looked up from the document she'd been working on. "The Hendricks property, on the Western Ridge. He made the offer last week. The Hendricks took it yesterday." Elara turned this over. The Hendricks property sat on the western side of the valley, which was not adjacent to the water table she'd identified, not within the arc of the 3 targeted properties, and this was precisely what was wrong with it. It was not where she would have expected Crowe to buy land, which meant she'd been wrong about something, or she was missing something, or he was doing something she hadn't accounted for. She spread the valley map on the table. She looked at the Hendricks property. She looked at Blackstone. She looked at the position of the western ridge relative to the channel system she'd been building. He's going to try to divert the upper spring, she said. Dutch set his coffee cup down. The Hendricks property borders the creek that feeds the upper mountain spring, she said, tracing the line with her finger. If Crowe controls that land, he controls access to the spring's source. He doesn't need to win the boundary dispute on the east field. He just needs to cut off the water at the top before it reaches the underground table. She looked up. The channel system I'm building connects the springs to the table. The spring goes dry or is diverted, the channel doesn't matter. Agnes watched her with steady eyes. Can he do that? Legally? He owns the land now. Water rights in this territory are attached to surface ownership of the source area. She paused. It depends on how the original water rights were documented. If the spring was ever registered as a shared or common resource. It wasn't, Colton said. He said it with the flatness of a man who already knew the answer and wished he didn't. Nobody registered the springs. Nobody thought they needed to. The room was quiet. Elara looked at the map. She looked at the line of the channel, the position of the spring, the distance between them. She looked at the hearing date on the calendar. She'd tacked to the wall 3 weeks away, which was now not just the date of the land dispute hearing, but the deadline before which she needed to solve a problem she hadn't known she had 48 hours ago. We need to file for a water rights review, she said, independent of the land dispute. On the basis of prior use, if Blackstone Ranch has been using the spring water, however informally, for long enough to establish precedent, we have a claim. How long is long enough? Agnes asked. 7 years under territorial statute, Elara said. She looked at Colton. How long has the ranch been using the spring runoff? Since my father's time, he said. At least 20 years. Do you have anything that documents it? He thought. The original land survey mentioned the spring. That's not used documentation. That's proximity documentation. She tapped the table. I need someone who can testify that the ranch used the spring water. A neighbor, a former hand. Anyone who was here in the early years and can say under oath that the water ran onto Blackstone land and was used by Blackstone Ranch. Eb Calloway, Colton said immediately. He's been here 40 years. He'd have seen it. She was already standing. Can you get a message to him today? Jesse can ride out. Send him. She rolled the map up. Agnes. The older woman looked at her. Thank you for coming. I mean that. Agnes straightened her coat, which didn't need straightening. I've lived in this valley a long time, she said. I've watched Barton Crowe buy things and bury people for 11 years. Nobody ever had documents before. She stood up. I thought you should know about the Hendricks property. After she left, the house was quiet except for the sound of Jesse being sent out with a message and Clem's hooves on the drive. Colton looked at Elara. What are the odds? She pulled on her coat and picked up her notebook. She thought about being honest and decided that honest was the only thing she'd ever been any good at. 2 weeks ago, I'd have said fair now. She paused. We have the land case, which is solid. We have the fraud documentation, which is useful. We now have a water rights problem that we didn't have before, which means we're fighting on 2 fronts with 3 weeks to go. And I think we can still win, but not if we're careful. Careful is what Barton Crowe expects. She met his eyes. We need to move faster than he thinks we can. He held her gaze. Tell me what you need. She needed 3 things. The first was Eb Calloway's testimony, which Jesse secured by Friday. Eb, who had watched the spring runoff move through the lower creek and onto Blackstone land since 1858, which was 12 years before Colton's father had even acquired the deed, and who was willing to say so in front of any judge who cared to ask. The second was a review of the territorial water statutes, which Pierce handled from Harmon, and which revealed that prior use doctrine applied in this territory even without formal registration, provided the use could be demonstrated to be continuous and non-contested for the required period. Barton Crowe had purchased the Hendricks property 11 days ago. Prior to that, he had made no claim on the spring. Clock on his water rights did not start 11 years ago when he arrived in the valley. Started 11 days ago. The third thing she needed was something she hadn't expected to need, and it came from the direction she least expected it. Came from Marta Boone. Marta arrived at Blackstone on a Thursday evening, a week and a half before the hearing, with a piece of paper in her hand and the specific expression, someone who has found something they don't entirely know what to do with. "My husband kept records," she said, setting the paper on the table. "I told you that." "Yes," Elara said. "He also kept correspondence. Letters. He was a thorough man." She tapped the paper. "This is a letter he received in 1879 from a surveyor named Grady." T.R. Grady, Elara looked up. "Grady surveyed the North Ridge for my husband that year," Marta said. "Routine work." But the letter, she pushed it closer. "Read the second paragraph." The second paragraph, in Grady's cramped professional handwriting, referenced a commission survey he had recently completed for a private party unnamed in the Red Hollow Valley, and noted that the commission seal stamp currently in use by his office was due to be replaced the following year, as the die had worn and the impression was no longer meeting commission standards. Elara read it twice. Then she looked at Marta. "This is 1879, she said. "Crowe Holdings survey is dated 1873. "Yes," Marta said. "If Grady's seal stamp was already worn in 1879, worn enough that he was replacing it, then the stamp in use in 1873 would have been in good condition. Crisp impression. Not the off-measurement impression that Aldous identified." "That's what I thought," Marta said. She sat down. "I almost didn't look at it. I've been through those boxes a dozen times in 2 years, but this was in a folder with the survey plats for the North Pasture, and I'd never unfolded the letter." Elara held the letter carefully and thought about 2 years of a woman going through her dead husband's boxes, looking for something that might save the ranch he'd built. "May I take this to Pierce?" "That's why I brought it." Colton had come in from outside somewhere during this exchange. He stood in the doorway, reading the room. "What did she find?" he asked. "Grady's own letter, describing his seal stamp as worn in 1879, Elara said, "which means the seal on the 1873 survey shouldn't look like a worn stamp. It should look like a stamp in its prime." She set the letter down. Barton Crowe's attorneys used a worn stamp to fake a 1873 survey, and the letter that proves the stamp couldn't have been worn in 1873 has been sitting in a box on Marta Boone's North Ridge for 20 years. Kitchen was quiet. Dutch, who was in the corner where Dutch always seemed to appear when things mattered, poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of Marta without a word. Marta picked it up. "Is it enough?" Colton asked. Elara looked at the letter. She looked at the calendar on the wall. She thought about Pierce and Aldous and the consolidated filing and Ebb Calloway's 40 years of watching that spring run. She thought about Thomas's journals and Jesse's notes about the horses in the night and the survey stakes moved 2 inches in the dark by people who thought nobody would notice. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." She said it carefully, because she'd learned over the years and the miles and the problems she'd been handed and the problems she'd walked herself into, that certainty was a thing you earned rather than assumed. But she said it because the letter was real. The records were real. The water under the East Field was real. All of it was real, and it was documented. And in 10 days it would be in front of a territorial judge who would have to decide what to do with a man who had been quietly reshaping a valley for a decade and had finally moved fast enough to leave tracks. She reached for her notebook. There was work to do. Pierce read Marta's letter twice, set it down, picked it up, and read it a third time. Elara had come to understand how Pierce processed good news. He didn't smile. He didn't make sounds of satisfaction. He read things more times than necessary because he was a man who trusted repetition over instinct and who had been practicing law long enough to know that what looked like a winning piece of evidence at first glance sometimes revealed its flaws on the fourth. The fourth reading didn't reveal any flaws. "This is Grady's own hand?" he asked. "My husband corresponded with him on survey work in 1879, Marta said. She was sitting across the desk from Pierce with her coat still on, because she'd ridden to Harmon with Elara that morning and hadn't entirely warmed through yet. I have other letters from the same period for comparison, if you need them. I'll need them. He set the letter down with the careful flatness of someone placing something valuable on a surface. This, combined with Aldos's registry notation, gives us a contemporaneous account of the seal's condition from the man who used it. If Grady himself documented the stamp as worn in 1879, and the commission standard requires a specific impression depth for certified surveys, then the 1873 document, which should show a stamp in prime condition, showing instead the characteristics of a worn stamp, is not a discrepancy that can be explained by storage or age. It can only be explained by someone who made the document later, Elara said, after the stamp had worn. Yes, Pierce folded his hands on the desk. Which means whoever forged the survey had access to Grady's stamp at some point after 1879 when it was already degraded, or made a copy that replicated the worn impression accidentally. Or deliberately, Marta said, to make it look aged. Pierce looked at her. That would require a level of sophistication in the forgery that suggests professional involvement. Barton Crowe employs sophisticated people, Elara said. Yes, he does. Pierce was quiet for a moment. I'm going to contact the federal land office in addition to the territorial court. This has crossed from civil boundary dispute into potential criminal fraud, and I want that established in the record before the hearing, not after. He looked at Elara. That changes the strategy somewhat. How? At the territorial hearing, our primary argument is the validity of the original boundaries and the prior use doctrine on the water rights. That remains. But the fraud element needs to be introduced carefully if we lead with it, and the judge feels we're overreaching. It colors the land argument. He tapped his finger on the desk. We present the land evidence first. Clean, documented, straightforward. The 1869 survey, the 3 corroborating documents, Ebby Calloway's testimony. We establish that the boundary claim fails on its own merits. Then we introduce the sealed discrepancy, and Grady's letter as evidence that the claim was not merely incorrect, but knowingly false. Building blocks, Elara said. Exactly. He looked at the documents arranged in front of him. Their attorneys will argue the seal discrepancy is a reproduction artifact, that copying documents introduces variations that don't reflect the original. We need to be prepared for that. Aldous can testify that he compared the filed document's seal against original commission surface in the same period, not copies originals. Elara had thought this through on the ride to Harmon. The variation isn't between a copy and an original. It's between the filed document and contemporaneous originals from the same office. Pierce nodded slowly. Can Aldous be compelled to testify? He came to me voluntarily with his findings, she said. I believe he'll testify. He's a careful man. He doesn't want this on his registry. Good. Pierce made a note. The water rights filing I submitted that last week. Prior use doctrine, continuous use, documented by the original land survey mention and corroborated by Calloway's testimony. The Hendricks purchase gives Crowe surface ownership of the spring source area, but it doesn't extinguish a prior use claim that predates his ownership by 20 years. Will the judge see it that way? Pierce looked up at her. Judge Harlan Foss is not a man who looks favorably on consolidation of resources by any single party. He ruled against a mining company 3 years ago that tried to claim water rights over prior farming use. A pause. He is also not a man who looks favorably on people who waste his time. We go in with exactly what we have. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing speculative. Every claim supported by a document or a witness. Understood, Elara said. They rode back to Red Hollow in the afternoon, and Elara spent the evening at the kitchen table, writing out the evidentiary summary, the way she wrote out everything in clear, undecorated sentences that said exactly what they meant and nothing more. Colton came in at 9 and set a plate of food beside her without being asked, which she ate without looking up from what she was writing, and he sat across from her with his own coffee and read through the document she'd already finished, making small marks where he had questions. It was a peculiar kind of eveningness. Not comfortable exactly. There was too much at stake for comfortable but functional, in the way that 2 people working on the same problem can become functional. The particular rhythm of it, person's presence, making the other's work slightly more possible. You wrote this part wrong, Colton said at one point. She looked up. Which part? He turned the page toward her and pointed. You said the spring runoff historically moved through the lower East Creek. It didn't. It moved through the South Tributary first. The lower East Creek is downstream of that. She looked at it. He was right. How do you know? I've ridden that land since I was 8 years old. He handed the page back. The South Tributary is the one that runs dry first in a drought year. My father used to say that's how you knew summer had arrived. She corrected it and thought about what that meant, that he knew this land in a way she never would, not from surveys and diagrams, but from years of being in it, and that she knew things about it he would never have thought to look for. That they were, in some way she hadn't anticipated when she'd walked up this drive 6 weeks ago, necessary to each other's understanding of the same problem. She wrote the correction into the summary and didn't say any of that out loud, because it wasn't the moment for it, and because some things were better understood than said. 6 days before the hearing, the second attack came. It wasn't horses in the night this time. It was water. Specifically, the absence of it. Jesse found it at dawn. He'd gone to check the third test shaft as part of his morning rotation, and he came back to the house at a run, which was not Jesse's typical speed, and knocked on Elara's door before it was fully light. "The shaft's dry," he said when she opened the door. She looked at him. "What?" "Shaft 3, the one you dug first. It was at 14 feet of standing water 2 days ago. This morning it's dry." He was out of breath, not from the distance, but from the information. "The first shaft is low. Second shaft looks all right still." She dressed and went out with him. He was not wrong. The third shaft, which had been the proving well, the one that had convinced Colton, that had started everything, was dry to the bottom. The clay around the base of the shaft was still damp, which meant the water had been there recently. It hadn't dried up. It had gone somewhere, or been sent somewhere. She walked from the third shaft to the second, and then north along the line of the underground table as best she understood it, and she found what she was looking for about 100 yards north of the property line, in a shallow draw that had probably always been there, and that she had walked past a dozen times without looking at it the right way. Someone had cut a channel. Not a sophisticated one, rough work. Done quickly, probably at night, designed not to redirect the water permanently, but to bleed enough of the underground pressure that the test shafts showed dry. The cut ran from the draw into a depression on Crowe's side of the fence line, where it would evaporate into the alkaline soil and be lost. It was wasteful and purposeful, and the kind of thing that left no signature if you didn't know to look for it. She stood at the edge of the cut and looked at it for a long time. Then she measured it and sketched it and walked the line back to the property boundary, marking exactly where it crossed from Blackstone land to Crowe's. And she went back to the house and told Colton. He listened without interrupting, which was something he'd gotten better at over the past 6 weeks. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to make it look like the water was never there," he said. "Or trying to give us a reason to withdraw. If the well looks dry, if the project appears to have failed." She spread her notes on the table. "It's possible he's just angry, and this is what anger looks like when a man has people willing to dig channels in the dark. Can it be fixed? The cut can be filled. The water pressure will reestablish within a few days once the bleed is sealed." She looked at him. "But we need to document this before we fill it. Witnesses, measurements, the location relative to the property line. This is tampering with a water resource that we have a prior use claim on. It needs to be in the record. Who do we bring?" "Dutch." "Jesse. And I want Agnes Pruitt." He looked at her. "Agnes. She's known in this valley for 20 years. She's not a party to the dispute. If she stands at that cut and looks at it, and can describe what she saw in a courtroom, that's more credible than any of us." Elara folded her hands on the table. "Can you get her out here by this afternoon?" He sent Jesse to town. Agnes arrived at 2 o'clock on a horse she rode, with the confident practicality of a woman who had never stopped riding, just because the town didn't require it. And she walked the line of the cut with Elara, looking at everything Elara pointed to, with the direct attention of someone who understood that she was being asked to remember, rather than simply observe. "That's on Crowe's land," Agnes said when they reached the property line. She was pointing at where the cut discharged into the depression. "That draw is on the east side of the old prior fence. That's always been Crowe's boundary." "Yes," Elara said. "So someone crossed your property line to cut this channel?" "Yes." Agnes looked at the cut, at the still faintly damp trace of it in the earth. "At night?" "Almost certainly." Agnes was quiet for a moment. My father ran sheep on the South Ridge, she said, not quite to Elara. When I was a girl, there was a man who bought out 3 of his neighbors by poisoning their wells. Nothing was ever proven. She looked at Elara. I'll testify. Thank you. Don't thank me. Agnes turned back toward the ranch. I've been waiting 11 years for someone to give Barton Crowe a reason to stand in front of a judge. They filled the cut that afternoon, and Dutch reported within 2 days that the water level in Shaft 2 had stabilized, and Shaft 1 was recovering. Shaft 3 would take longer, but it was moving in the right direction. The underground table was intact. It had been inconvenienced, not destroyed, which told Elara something about the nature of what had been done. It was designed to alarm, rather than actually eliminate, which meant that even Crowe's people understood the water was too significant and too deep to be casually neutralized. This was useful to know. What was also useful, Jesse had found boot prints at the site of the cut. 3 sets, 2 of which were unremarkable, and 1 of which had a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel, a deep groove at the outer edge. The kind of thing that happens when a man favors one side of his stride over years of walking on uneven ground. Jesse had noticed this because Elara had taught him to notice things like this, and he'd made a sketch in his notebook with the measurements, which he brought to her with the cautious pride of someone who is not sure their contribution is significant enough, but has brought it anyway. She looked at the sketch. This is good work, she said. He looked like he might say something, and then didn't, which was fine. Some things didn't need words around them. She showed the sketch to Pierce when she rode to Harmon the following day to deliver the final documentation package. He added it to the evidence file without significant comment, but she noticed him look at it twice. The night before the hearing, nobody at Blackstone Ranch slept much. This was not discussed. It was simply a fact, like the weather, acknowledged by the evidence of people moving around the house at hours when they shouldn't have been moving around. Elara heard the floorboards settle under Dutch's weight at 2 in the morning. She heard Jesse, whose bunk was below the window of her room, go outside at 4 and come back in 20 minutes later, probably to check the shafts. She heard Colton in the kitchen sometime between 3 and 4, the quiet sounds of a man who cannot be still trying to be still. She lay on her back and went through the evidence the way she'd gone through it 100 times, not rehearsing it exactly, but checking it the way you check gear before a difficult crossing. Looking for weaknesses, looking for the place where something might give. She found one, near dawn. It was not a fatal weakness, but it was a real one. Pierce planned to rely heavily on Aldis's testimony about the seal comparison, and Aldis was a man who had, at their first meeting, shown an instinct for self-protection. In a courtroom, under cross-examination by Crowe's attorneys, that instinct might manifest as qualification, hedge, a tendency to narrow what he'd said until it no longer meant what it had meant in his office. She couldn't control this. She could only have done what she'd done, which was document his registry notation and file it before he had a chance to think better of it. She lay there in the dark and thought, this might not be enough. Then she thought, it's what we have. Then she got up and made coffee, because there was no utility in lying there thinking, and the fire needed to be started before anyone else needed it. Colton came into the kitchen at 5:30 and found her at the table with her notes and her coffee, which was probably not a surprise to him at this point. Did you sleep? He asked. Some. He poured himself a cup and sat across from her and looked at her notes without looking at them. The way people look at things they've looked at too many times. If we lose, he said. Let's not start there. I'm not starting there. I'm being practical. He turned his cup in his hands. If the hearing goes wrong, if the judge doesn't see the fraud question, the way Pierce thinks he will, what are the options? She looked at him. He deserved a straight answer. Appeal, the territorial level, and if necessary, federal. The Grady letter and Aldis's notation go into the record either way, which means the fraud question doesn't disappear even if the boundary ruling goes against us. She paused. The water rights claim is separate from the land boundary claim. Even if Crowe wins on the east field boundary, the prior use doctrine on the spring water is a different proceeding. He doesn't win both automatically, so we could lose the field and keep the water. In theory, it's not the clean outcome. No, he was quiet, but we'd still have the channel. If we have the water rights and the channel is built. Yes, she looked at him. The channel matters regardless of how the hearing goes. That's why I never stopped building it. He nodded slowly. He was not a man who found uncertainty comfortable. She'd understood that about him early, but he'd gotten better at sitting with it, at not resolving it artificially just to have resolution. She thought that was probably something he'd had to learn, and not something he'd been born with, and she found this more interesting than if it had been natural to him. "Whatever happens today," he said. He stopped, started again. "You came here 6 weeks ago, and you fixed the irrigation on the first day. You found the water on the 6th. You found the fraud." He looked at her directly. "Whatever a judge in Harmon says, this ranch is in better shape than it's been in 5 years. That's not nothing." She looked at him for a moment. "It's not nothing," she agreed. It was not a speech, and he was not a man who made speeches. It was just the plain truth of a thing, said plainly, and she received it the same way. They rode to Harmon in a group. Colton, Elara, Dutch, Marta, Thomas Calloway, and his father Ebb, who sat his horse at 73, with the iron uprightness of a man who has decided this is a hill and has chosen it. Agnes Pruitt came in her own buggy, driven by her nephew, and pulled up alongside them on the main road, with her Sunday coat on and her hat pinned straight. It looked, Elara thought, like something. Like the kind of thing that got described afterward when people talked about a day. She was not prone to dramatic thinking, and she set the thought aside and focused on the road. The territorial courthouse in Harmon was a 2-story sandstone building that smelled of chalk dust and old wood, and the particular institutional gravity of a place where consequential things had happened and would happen again. Pierce met them outside, with his coat brushed and his briefcase closed, and the manner of a man who has done the preparation and is ready to be done with the waiting. "Any word from the examiner?" Elara asked. "His written findings were filed this morning." Pierce's expression gave nothing away, which was either professional composure or deliberate restraint. He confirmed the seal discrepancy. He also found a second anomaly. The survey's notational abbreviations don't match the commission's standard for 1,873. They match an updated standard that wasn't adopted until 1,881. Elara absorbed this. He's saying the document was made after 1,881. He's saying it's consistent with documents made after 1,881. He's careful with language. Pierce almost smiled. "But it's in the record." Colton exhaled. She heard it beside her and understood it. They went inside. Crowe's legal team was already present, 3 attorneys, which was 2 more than Pierce had, and which announced their client's resources before anyone opened a briefcase. Crowe himself sat in the gallery, not at the table, which Elara noted. He had positioned himself as an observer, which was either confident or strategic or both. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back. There was no performance in it on either side, just 2 people who understood the shape of what was happening, making sure the other one understood they understood. She sat down beside Pierce and opened her notes. Judge Harlan Foss was 60 compact, with the kind of measured blankness that good judges develop over years of hearing people argue past each other. He came in without ceremony, sat, and looked at the room. Crowe Holdings versus Blackstone Ranch, Boone Property, and Calloway Homestead. Consolidated, he said, combined with the prior use water rights petition filed by the same parties. He looked at both tables. "We have a lot of ground to cover. Let's not waste time." Crowe's lead attorney, a man named Strand, who was polished in the way of someone who has spent a career in cities arguing before territorial judges who find that kind of polish faintly irritating, presented the boundary claim first. He was articulate and well organized, and he spent 45 minutes establishing the Crowe Holdings position with a certified copy of the 1,873 survey as its cornerstone. Pierce presented the consolidated defense with the 1,869 survey, the 3 corroborating property documents, and Ebb Calloway on the witness stand. Ebb was 73 years old and had never been in a courtroom in his life, and he sat in the witness chair as if someone had put a fence post in it and told it to be useful. He answered Pierce's questions in complete sentences and did not embellish and did not hedge, and when Strand tried to suggest on cross-examination that his memory at 73 might not be reliable, Ebby looked at him with the expression of a man who has spent half a century making decisions on the basis of accurate memory and said, "I remember the anvil stones. I remember the boundary. I was there." Strand moved on. Agnes Pruitt testified about the cut channel. She described what she had seen with the precision of a woman who understood she was being asked to remember, and who had consequently made it her business to remember correctly. When Strand suggested she might be mistaken about the location relative to the property boundary, she produced a handwritten note she'd made the day she'd seen it, which she'd had the presence of mind to date and sign. This was something she had not told Elara she was doing. Strand looked at the note and then at Strand's own notes and did not pursue that line. The seal evidence came in the afternoon. Aldous testified. He was not the witness. Elara had hoped for he qualified things more than she'd anticipated, used language that left more room than she'd wanted. But he was truthful about what he'd observed, and he didn't walk back the core finding. The Seal and the Crow Holdings survey did not match the impression characteristics of original commission surveys from 1873. He said it clearly. He said it once. He didn't elaborate, but he didn't retract. The examiner's written findings were entered into the record and read aloud by the clerk. The second anomaly, the notational abbreviations, consistent with post-1881 standards, produced a long silence in the room when the clerk finished reading. Strand objected. The objection was argued. Pierce argued back with the specificity of a man who had spent the previous week becoming an expert in Territorial Commission notation standards, which was not a sentence Elara had expected to think, but which was accurate. Voss listened to both sides and then said he would take the examiner's findings under consideration. The water rights petition was heard last. At 4 in the afternoon, when the light in the courthouse had gone from direct to oblique and everyone in the room was tired in the way that produces either clarity or error, depending on the person, Pierce presented the prior use argument cleanly. Continuous documented use of the spring water, predating Crowe's purchase of the Hendricks property by 20 years, supported by the original land survey notation, Ebb Calloway's testimony, and operational records from all 3 properties. Strand argued that surface ownership of the spring source area conveyed water rights regardless of prior use custom. Voss looked at Strand for a moment when he finished this argument. Prior use doctrine exists specifically to address the scenario you're describing, he said. Are you asking me to rule that a purchase made last month extinguishes 20 years of continuous documented use? Strand began to rephrase. Voss let him finish and then moved on. At 4:30, Voss recessed the hearing. He would issue his ruling in writing within 10 days. He made no preliminary indications. He was not that kind of judge, but when he left the bench, he paused briefly at the clerk's table and said something too quiet for the gallery to hear, and the clerk nodded. The room began to move, people standing, voices starting up. Elara sat still for a moment. Colton was beside her. She felt rather than saw him looking at her. Well, he said quietly. She thought about the seal evidence, about E.B. in the witness chair, about Agnes's handwritten note and Pierce's argument on prior use and the examiner's second anomaly, which had produced that silence in the room. About Voss's question to Strand, which had not been a question at all. I don't know, she said, but I think it went the way it needed to. He nodded. He didn't push for more certainty than that, which was one of the things about him that she'd come to understand was not resignation, but something closer to its opposite, the capacity to live with open questions without needing to close them prematurely. Outside, the group gathered on the courthouse steps in the cooling afternoon. Ebb shook Pierce's hand. Thomas and Jesse, who had ridden over that morning and sat in the gallery all day without being asked, stood together talking with the tentative energy of young men who have witnessed something significant and are still processing what to do with it. Marta stood with her arms folded, looking out at the street, with an expression that said she was tallying something. Agnes Pruitt came to stand beside Elara. You didn't know I wrote it down, she said. No, Elara said. I didn't. That was good thinking. Agnes looked out at the street. My father taught me when you see something that matters, write it down before the day ends. Memory is honest in the moment. It gets shaped by what happens after. She pulled her coat straight. He was right about most things. He sounds like he was, Elara said. Barton Crowe came out of the courthouse behind his attorneys, and the group on the steps went quiet. The way groups go quiet when a thing they've been focused on for weeks suddenly becomes present. He walked past without stopping, but he paused at the bottom of the steps and looked back, not at the group generally, but at Elara specifically. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look said what it said, this isn't over. She looked back at him and thought, "You're right, but it's going the way it's going." He got into his buggy and left. Dutch, who had stood at the edge of the group all day, in the way Dutch stood at the edge of all groups, came to stand beside Elara as the sound of the buggy wheels faded. "He's not done," Dutch said. "No," she agreed. "What does he do next?" She watched the street where Crowe's buggy had gone. She thought about a man who had spent 11 years building something and was watching it develop a crack, and the things that kind of man did when he stopped trying to manage the situation legally and started trying to manage it the other way. "I don't know exactly," she said, "but I know we need to be ready for it not to be a document." Dutch looked at her sideways. "You think he moves on the ranch?" "I think he's run out of paper." She turned away from the street. "Let's go home." The ride back was quieter than the ride out, which was its own kind of information about how much tension had been running through all of them without being discussed. Colton rode beside her on the long, flat stretch before the valley opened up, and the sky in the west had gone the deep orange of late September evening. And somewhere ahead of them, the east field sat above the water table that they'd fought 6 weeks to prove existed and to keep. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she agreed. And then we know. She looked ahead at the road. The ranch was still an hour away. The channel work was 3/4 done. The shafts had recovered. Case was as good as they could make it, and what came next was in the hands of a judge they'd done everything they could to reach. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't over. It was where they were, and she had long ago learned that where you were was the only place you could actually do anything. "And then we know," she said. The 10 days were not quiet. Elara had known they wouldn't be. She'd told Dutch as much on the ride back from Harmon, and Dutch had received this information with his characteristic stillness, the kind that meant he was already filing it into the part of himself that made decisions, rather than the part that had opinions about them. By the time they reached the ranch that evening, he'd already rearranged the night rotation without being asked. First 3 days passed without incident, which was its own kind of pressure. Waiting for something you know is coming and cannot see is harder than the thing itself, in Elara's experience. You can't measure it. You can't document it. You can only stay ready, which is exhausting in a way that action never is. She worked on the channel. It was the right thing to do, regardless of what was coming. The channel was 73% complete by her measurement, and every section they finished was infrastructure that existed in the world independent of any court ruling. If the judge found for them, the channel would carry water to the fields by spring. If the judge found against them, the channel still a thing she'd built that had never existed before she came here, and no one could unbuild it in a day. She found this thought useful. Jessie worked beside her and had gotten genuinely good at the grade work, not just following her measurements now, but anticipating the next section, reading the way she'd taught him by pointing at things until he started seeing them himself. He didn't call attention to this improvement, which she appreciated. Growth that announces itself is almost always slower than growth that just quietly happens. On the 4th day, Thomas Calloway rode over from his father's homestead with news that Barton Crowe had visited the Hendricks property, the one he'd bought on the western ridge, and had spent several hours there with 2 men Thomas didn't recognize. Thomas had seen them from the ridge trail above, which gave him a clear sight line but no audio. "What were they doing?" Elara asked. "Looking at the spring," Thomas said. "One of them had instruments. Surveying equipment, maybe. Or something like it." She thought about this. "How close is the Hendricks property line to the upper spring source?" 40 yards, maybe 50. On Crowe's side of the line. She went inside and looked at the map. She looked at the line of the upper spring, its source in the mountain drainage, the path it took down the slopes before it fed into the underground table via the secondary channel she'd identified in the original survey. Spring itself emerged from the rock on Blackstone land. It crossed into what was now Crowe's territory for approximately 200 yards before returning to the drainage that fed Blackstone's section. 200 yards was enough to work with if you were a man with resources and a reason to move fast. "He's going to try to divert the spring before the ruling comes," she said. Colton was behind her. She hadn't heard him come in, but he was there, reading the same map over her shoulder. Not the underground table, the source. If he cuts the spring at the Hendricks property before the water rights ruling comes through, the diversion is a physical fact before a court order can prevent it. Can he do that? Legally. while the petition is pending. Petition is pending, not decided. There's no court order in place preventing actions on his own land. She turned. We'd need an injunction. Pierce would have to file an emergency injunction to stop any diversion work on the Hendricks property until the water rights question is decided. How fast can Pierce do that? She was already getting her coat. I'm going to find out. She rode to Harmon alone, which Colton objected to, and which she did anyway, because sending Jesse or waiting for Dutch to be available would cost hours she didn't have, and because she had been riding places alone for long enough that the objection, however well-intentioned, was not something she had space for right now. Pierce was in his office. He listened to what she'd observed Thomas's account, the map, the timeline, with his hands folded, and his expression doing nothing. Emergency injunction to halt any alteration of natural watercourses on the Hendricks property, pending resolution of the prior use petition, he said when she finished. Yes. Can you file today? I can draft it today. Filing requires the clerk's office, which closes at 5. He looked at the clock on his wall. It was 2:30. Tight. Then let's start. She sat in Pierce's office for the next 2.5 hours while he drafted, and she read the draft twice and caught 2 places where the language could be tightened, and 1 place where a specific statutory citation needed to be added, and Pierce accepted both corrections and the citation, with the equanimity of a man who had no professional ego about being right versus being accurate. They filed at 4:53. The clerk, a different one from Aldous, younger, with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone new enough to the job to still find it meaningful, accepted the filing and stamped it, and said that a copy would be forwarded to Judge Foss's chambers by end of business. Elara rode back in the dark. Colton met her at the gate with a lantern, which was not something she'd expected, and which she received without comment, handing Clem off and walking beside him to the house with the tiredness of a day that had been too long in the particular way that days defined by paperwork are long, not physically exhausting, but mentally wrung out, the way you feel after spending hours trying to build a structure out of words that will hold against someone who is trying to knock it down. Did you eat today? He asked, at some point. That's not an answer. The honest one. He went to the stove. She sat at the table and looked at nothing for a moment, which she rarely allowed herself and which she permitted now, because there was no one else in the kitchen and because the lamp was low and the house was quiet and she was tired in a way that needed a minute of not performing competence for an audience. He put food in front of her. She ate it. The injunction will either stop him or it won't, she said at some point. If it stops him, we have time. If it doesn't, if he moves on the spring before the order can be served, then we're dealing with a physical diversion that a court ruling can order reversed. But reversing a diversion is harder than preventing one. You think he'll move tonight? I think he's a man who has watched his legal position deteriorate for 6 weeks and has identified one remaining lever. I think he'll pull it as soon as he understands we have filed the injunction. She looked at her plate, which means tonight or tomorrow, depending on how fast information moves from the clerk's office to his attorney's. Colton sat down across from her. Then we watched the spring. Yes, I know that land. I can put 2 men on the Hendricks boundary line tonight, in the draw above the spring. They'll see anyone coming up from the western side. She looked at him. Don't put them in a position where they'd confront anyone directly. I know, he said. He said it with the slight edge of a man who doesn't need to be told the obvious thing. And she accepted that. It was fair. Who do you trust for this, he thought. Dutch and Cutter. Not Jesse. No, he stood up. Jesse's good. But this is the kind of thing where being good isn't the question. The kind of thing where you need someone who's been in worse situations and knows how to hold still. She thought about this. That's a good distinction. He got his coat. Dutch and Cutter were on the ridge above the spring by 10 o'clock, settled into the kind of patient invisibility that men develop when they've spent enough winters moving quietly through terrain that doesn't forgive noise. They had no weapons visible, carried lanterns unlit, and had instructions that amounted to, watch, and if you see anyone with tools or equipment near the spring, one of you comes back immediately while the other stays on position. Elara sat up until 2 in the morning, doing the thing she did when she couldn't sleep and couldn't stop thinking, which was work. She went through the evidentiary summary one more time, looking for the weak places, the way you press on a thing to find where it gives. The seal evidence was solid. The examiner had put it in writing, and it was in the record. The 1,869 survey and the corroborating documents were solid. Ebb Calloway's testimony was solid in the particular way that old men who have been in places for a long time are solid, not sophisticated, not legal, just irrefutably present. The thing she kept returning to was Aldous. She'd been right to worry about him on the witness stand. He'd held, but not firmly he'd qualified things. Retreated to technical language when the cross-examination pressed him, given the judge less clarity than the facts supported. Strand had worked that gap, suggesting that the seal discrepancy was a matter of interpretation, that different commission offices used different dyes, that Aldis's comparison, while interesting, was not definitive. It wasn't definitive. The examiner's findings were stronger. But Voss was the kind of judge who weighed everything, and she didn't know which way that particular weight would fall when he was alone with it. She closed her notes at 2:15 and went to bed and was asleep within minutes, which was the practical gift of exhaustion. Dutch came back at 4:30 in the morning. She heard him on the porch and was up before he knocked. Opened the door and read his face, which showed the particular arrangement of a man delivering information he's been holding carefully since the moment he obtained it. 3 men came up the western draw about an hour ago, he said. Picks and a crowbar. They started working the rock above the spring source. She kept her face steady. Cutters still there? Still there. I came straight back. How far did they get? They'd cleared about 2 feet of surface rock when I left. Working by lantern. He looked at her. They knew exactly where to go. They'd been there before. She turned and knocked on Colton's door. He was awake. She suspected he'd barely slept. She told him what Dutch had said in 2 sentences. He was dressed in 4 minutes. We go to the spring, he said. No. She put her hand on his arm without thinking about it, and he stopped. If we go there and confront them physically, we give Crowe what he wants. Men in a dispute at night, on a boundary line, with tools and tempers that becomes a different story than trespassing and tampering. He looked at her. She could feel the tension in him, not anger, exactly, but the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of watching someone dismantle what he'd spent years building, and the particular difficulty of being told again to hold still. Then what, he said. We need a witness who isn't us, and we need to document what they've done before anyone touches it. She looked at Dutch. Can Cutter hold position until we get there with someone from town? He'll hold, Dutch said. Agnes, Colton said. Agnes. Elara was already moving. And the deputy, if there is one in Harmon who can reach us before dawn. There's a sheriff's deputy in Red Hollow, Colton said. Farnsworth. He's not a brave man, but he's an honest one. Get him. Colton went for Farnsworth. Elara went for Agnes, riding through the dark of the pre-dawn on a horse that did not want to be awake at this hour, and expressed this through the first half-mile before resigning itself. Agnes's house was lit when she arrived. Agnes, it turned out, was constitutionally a 4:30 in the morning person, a fact that surprised Elara and probably shouldn't have. She explained in 60 seconds. Agnes had her coat on in 90. They reached the spring draw as the sky was going from black to the first gray intimation of dawn. Cutter was where Dutch had left him, crouched in the shadow of a rock formation above the spring source with the motionless patience of a man who has been cold and still for 2 hours and has made peace with both. The 3 men from Crowe's outfit were still working. They'd made more progress in the interim. The surface rock above the spring was disturbed. A rough channel cut, beginning to take shape, pointed east toward the Hendricks property depression rather than down the natural slope toward Blackstone's drainage. Farnsworth, who was 42 and had the face of a man who'd spent his career hoping things wouldn't require action, looked at the scene from the ridge above with his lantern shielded by his coat, and then looked at Elara. That's definitely diversion work, he said. He sounded mildly aggrieved, as if reality had been inconsiderate. Yes, she said. I need you to go down there and identify yourself, and inform them that there is an injunction pending with the territorial court prohibiting alteration of natural watercourses on this property. Has the injunction been served? It was filed yesterday afternoon. It hasn't been served because it was filed after the sheriff's office closed. She looked at him evenly. But it exists, and these men either know about it or they don't, and either way they need to stop. Farnsworth looked at the men below, looked at his lantern, looked at Elara. I don't have jurisdiction over Crowe's property. You have jurisdiction over the spring, Colton said from behind her. His voice was not loud, but it had an edge that Farnsworth felt she could see it. The spring source is on Blackstone land, 20 yards of it before it crosses the property line. What they're doing up here, he pointed at the disturbed rock, is on my land. Farnsworth went down. He announced himself in the carrying voice of a man who has decided that volume is the better part of authority. The three workers stopped. There was a conversation that Elara couldn't fully hear from the ridge, but could partially read. The workers were not, apparently, inclined to argue with a badge at 4:30 in the morning over a diversion channel, and after approximately 4 minutes of discussion, they gathered their tools and left the way they'd come. Agnes had been documenting the scene with careful observation since she arrived. She produced her notebook, the same one she'd had at the cut channel, and wrote in it by lantern light while Elara measured the diversion work with a folding rule she'd had in her coat pocket. They'd cut 8 feet of channel, approximately 14 inches deep. It would have needed to be twice that length and depth to fully divert the spring flow, which meant they hadn't finished. But 8 feet of cut rock on a hillside above a spring source, measured and witnessed and written down, was 8 feet of evidence. Colton stood at the edge of the cut and looked at it. This is the second time, he said. Yes, she said. The channel in the east field was subtle. This isn't. He looked up at her. He's not trying to hide it anymore. No. She folded her rule. He's past being careful. That's useful information. How is it useful? She looked at him. Because men who stop being careful make mistakes that go into the record. And everything that goes into the record goes to Judge Voss. She put the rule back in her pocket. File report with Farnsworth before we go back. All of it. The workers, the tools, the time, the extent of the cut. His report is official documentation. Farnsworth wrote his report at the base of the hill by lantern light, with the resigned thoroughness of a man who has accepted that his morning was not going to improve and has decided to be competent about it. He dated and signed it, and gave Elara a copy, and she folded it into her coat beside the folding rule, where it would ride back to Harmon and into Pierce's hands before noon. The injunction was formally served on Crowe Holdings that same day, delivered to his ranch by the county sheriff, who was, unlike Farnsworth, a man who did not find action inconsiderate. The sheriff also received a copy of Farnsworth's overnight report, and Elara did not know what he made of it, but she noticed that he served the injunction personally, rather than sending a deputy, which suggested he'd read the report and drawn some conclusions. Pierce received the overnight documentation and filed a supplemental submission to Judge Voss Chambers before the close of business, citing the attempted diversion as evidence of ongoing effort to circumvent the court's eventual ruling on water rights. He included Farnsworth's report and Agnes's witness statement and Elara's measurements. Then there was nothing to do but wait for the remaining 3 days. The ruling came on the morning of the 10th day, not by letter but by the clerk from Harmon, who wrote out with it personally a young man named Will who had, apparently, been instructed to deliver it directly to the parties rather than post it. He arrived at Blackstone at 9:30, dusty from the road, with an envelope sealed with the court stamp. Marta was there. She'd come over the previous evening and stayed, which no one had explicitly arranged and which made complete sense. Thomas Calloway had ridden over that morning. Even Agnes was there, sitting in the kitchen with her coffee, and the patient equanimity of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that waiting for important things is simply part of having important things to wait for. Colton took the envelope from Will and looked at it for a moment. Then he handed it to Elara. She looked at him. It's your ranch. You built the case, he said. It was simply the truth, said without drama. She opened it. The ruling was 7 pages, which was thorough for Judge Voss, who was not a man who used 7 words when 4 would serve. She read it the way she read everything straight through. Once, quickly, looking for the shape of it before she looked at the details. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again, slowly. The boundary claim by Crowe Holdings was dismissed. The 1,873 survey was found to be inconsistent with established commission documentation standards for that period, as confirmed by the territorial examiner's findings, and was therefore insufficient to establish an alternative boundary to the one established by the 1,869 survey and corroborated by the 3 joint filers' historical documentation. The original boundary, as marked by the anvil stones, stood. All 3 properties retained their full acreage as originally deeded. The prior use water rights petition was granted. Blackstone Ranch, the Boone property, and the Callaway homestead were found to have established continuous documented use of the mountain spring water, predating any claim by Crowe Holdings by a minimum of 20 years, satisfying the territorial statute's prior use threshold. The water rights were formally registered to the 3 properties in proportion to historical documented use. The attempted diversion at the spring source was noted in the ruling's final section. Judge Voss found it consistent with a pattern of interference with a disputed natural resource pending judicial resolution, and referred the matter to the Federal Land Office for investigation of the underlying survey fraud allegation. He made no ruling on the fraud question that was federal jurisdiction, but he put it in writing that he was referring it, which meant it was in the record, and Barton Crowe's attorneys would now be managing not just a failed land claim but a federal inquiry. Elara lowered the pages. The kitchen was quiet. Everyone in it was looking at her. "We won," she said. She said it plainly, without theater, because that was how it deserved to be said. The boundary claim is dismissed. The water rights are ours. She looked at Marta. All 3 properties. Marta closed her eyes for one brief moment. Just one. Then she opened and looked at Thomas, who looked back at her with the expression of a young man who has been carrying something heavy on behalf of someone he loves and has just been told he can put it down. Dutch, in the corner, picked up his coffee cup and looked at it. Agnes set her cup down on the table with a small final sound. Jessie, who had been standing in the doorway since Will arrived, and who had been very still in the particular way of people, trying not to show how much something matters to them, let out a breath that he'd probably been holding for 10 days. Colton was looking at Elara. She looked back at him. His face showed the thing she'd seen on it the day she arrived, that quality she'd recognized as tiredness, but now understood more precisely as the specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something alone for a very long time. And in it now a change. The kind of change that isn't dramatic because it's real. Real things don't always announce themselves. They just shift, and then they're different. And you understand that they've been shifting for a while. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze. "Don't thank me. The case was real. The documents were real. We just made sure it got in front of someone who cared about real things." "That's not nothing," he said, giving her words back to her from 2 weeks ago. She almost smiled. "No," she said, "it's not nothing. The valley took time to understand what had happened, the way places take time to understand things that require them to revise what they thought they knew. The news moved through Red Hollow in the way that news moved there, faster than light, slower than consensus. The first wave was fact. Crowe Holdings lost. Blackstone, Boone, Callaway all ruled for. The second wave was context. The survey was fraudulent. Crowe's attorneys had built a land claim on a forged document. The third wave, and this one moved differently, quieter. The way important things move was about Elara Voss and what exactly she had done. Some people revised their opinions. Some people found reasons their original opinions had never really been what they were. This is the nature of opinion in small places, and Elara understood it and did not hold it against anyone, because holding it against people was a luxury that cost more than it returned. What she noticed more than the revision of opinions was the practical change. Within 2 weeks of the ruling, 3 neighboring ranchers came to her separately, with separate problems: a failing well, an irrigation inefficiency, a drainage question, and asked for her help. Not Colton's help, with her assistance. Her help, they came to her directly, used her name, knocked on the door of Blackstone Ranch, and asked for her by name. She helped all 3. The well was a relatively straightforward geology problem. The irrigation inefficiency took a week to diagnose and 2 days to address. The drainage question turned out to be more interesting than it had looked, and she spent several evenings working on it at the kitchen table in the now familiar position with the lamp and the cold coffee. Jesse sat with her for some of those evenings. He was doing something he wouldn't have described as studying, because he wouldn't have described it as anything. He was just present and asking questions when he had them, and thinking about what she showed him in the slow, thorough way that was becoming his particular manner of learning things. She thought he would be good at this work in a few years, if he wanted to be. She didn't tell him this, because it would have been premature, And because in her experience, people learn better when they're not managing someone else's expectation of them. Dutch never said much to her directly that changed in register after the ruling. He said roughly the same amount to her as before, in roughly the same tone. What changed was small things, the way he included her in the logistics conversations without the half-second pause that had been there at the beginning. The way he relayed information to her and Colton as a unit without the slight awkwardness of someone calculating who was the appropriate recipient. These were not large gestures. They were the real kind. The federal investigation into the survey fraud took 11 months. Elara was not directly involved in it. She gave a deposition in January and answered follow-up correspondence in March, and that was the extent of her formal participation. But she followed it the way you follow something you've set in motion and can't control, with attention and the measured patience of someone who understands that systems move at their own speed. In November of the following year, the Federal Land Commissioner's Office found sufficient evidence of deliberate fraud in the preparation and filing of the 1,873 survey document. Two of Barton Crowe's attorneys lost their territorial practice licenses. Crowe himself was not charged criminally. The investigators could not establish direct personal knowledge of the forgery, only that it had been done on his behalf, but he paid substantial penalties, and the Hendricks property, which he'd bought to control the spring source, was subject to a water rights restriction that made it considerably less valuable than he'd paid for it. He didn't leave the valley. Men like Barton Crowe rarely leave. They adjust and recalculate and continue. He remained the largest single landowner in the region, though he was no longer the only thing standing between everyone else and viability. The balance had shifted, not dramatically, not finally, but genuinely and measurably. This was, in Elara's estimation, the realistic version of winning. Not the erasure of a thing, but the reduction of it to a size that others could manage. She had never believed in the kind of resolution where the bad thing disappears cleanly and everyone exhales into a new world. She believed in changed odds. Changed odds were enough to work with. Changed odds were, in fact, what most real victories actually were, if you were honest about it. The channel was completed in December, 2 weeks before the first significant snow of the winter. The finishing was unglamorous. The way finishing always is, it's the middle sections that have drama, the beginning that has intention, and the end that has mostly just the last measurements and the last fittings and the quiet satisfaction of a thing being done rather than doing. Elara walked the full length of it on the day it was complete, in the particular gray light of a December afternoon that made everything look provisional. Jesse walked with her. Colton walked with her. At the end of the line where the channel connected to the secondary drainage from the east field, they stood and looked at the water moving. It was not a torrent. It was a seep, a trickle, a quiet dark line in the pale winter ground. But it was moving. It was moving from the spring to the table to the drainage, the whole design system of it, working the way she'd calculated it would work 6 months ago in a document that 3 men before her had looked at and walked away from. Jesse said, "It's smaller than I expected. It'll be stronger in spring," she said. "When the snowmelt comes." He nodded. He was looking at the water with the expression of someone who has helped build something and is in the first moments of understanding that it exists as a real thing rather than as a plan. Colton was quiet beside her. He'd been quiet the whole walk, which was different from his usual quiet in a way she'd learned to distinguish. The usual quiet was self-contained. This one was holding something. "What happens in spring?" he said. She looked at him. "Snowmelt comes. The channel carries it to the table. The table feeds the shafts. The shafts, that's not what I'm asking." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the winter field was still, the late afternoon light going gray and cold, the sound of the water in the channel the only real sound. "I know," she said. She'd been thinking about it herself, in the way she thought about most things, not around and around, but straight at it, when she let herself. She'd come here with a satchel and $43, and a reputation that had, charitably, described her as difficult. She'd stayed 6 months. The work had turned out to be more work than she'd contracted for, which was frequently the case with her work, because she found it difficult to identify the edge of a problem and stop at it. The problem kept having adjacent problems. The adjacent problems turned out to matter. "I have obligations," she said. "Things I left unfinished when I came here." This was true. There was a drainage project in a county 2 territories east that she'd walked away from. When she'd seen Colton's advertisement, and a woman there who ran a farming cooperative and who had not replaced her yet, based on the last letter she'd received in October. "I know," Colton said, "and I've never been particularly good at staying in one place. I know that too." She looked at the water in the channel. "You have what you need here. The water system. Jesse understands it well enough to maintain it. Dutch will make sure it's maintained. The legal position is solid." She said it not to push him away, but because it was true, and she thought truth was the right currency for this conversation. "You don't need me to stay for the ranch to work." He turned to look at her directly, which he did less often than most people, reserving the directness for moments when he meant it. "No," he said, "the ranch doesn't need you to stay." Jesse, who had been making himself very busy studying a section of channel fitting about 15 yards away, remained very busy for the duration of this conversation. He would be insufferable about it for approximately 3 days, which was his right. Elara looked at Colton. She thought about the ride to the Calloway homestead, and him almost laughing, and what it had cost him each time he said all right. She thought about the food set beside her when she hadn't asked for it, and the gate with the lantern in the dark, and the way he'd handed her the ruling envelope because the case was hers. She thought about the fact that staying in one place had always felt to her like a limitation, and had never, in 6 months at Blackstone Ranch, felt like that. This was information. She was, professionally and personally, a person who worked with what the information actually said, rather than what she'd expected it to say. "The Harkins Cooperative," she said. "I owe them a letter at minimum, and probably a visit to explain why I didn't come back when I said I would." "How long? A month, maybe 6 weeks." He held her gaze. He was not a man who showed relief openly, but she'd learned what it looked like on him. A slight release in the line of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible settling of something that had been braced. "All right," he said. The third time she'd heard him say it in 6 months, and this time it cost him something different, not control or pride, but the particular vulnerability of a man who has wanted something and has admitted it, which is harder than anything else he'd done in that time. And she understood this completely. "All right," she said back. She left for the Harkins Cooperative in January, with Clem, her satchel, and $43 that Colton paid her. Minus expenses, they'd argued about the math twice, and he'd won the second argument by the straightforward method of leaving the money on the table and walking out of the room. She was gone for 7 weeks. She wrote 2 letters. He wrote one, which was one more than she'd expected, and it said very little in a large amount of space, which she understood to be how he wrote letters. She came back in March, when the snowmelt was beginning, and the mountain springs were running strong, and the channel was carrying more water than she'd projected in her most optimistic calculations, which was the kind of outcome you document carefully rather than celebrate too early. Because documented things are repeatable, and celebrations are just feelings. Jesse was at the gate when she rode in. He had grown approximately 2 inches since January, which was not possible, and yet appeared to be true. He took Clem without being asked and said, casually, with the elaborately uninvested tone of a 20-year-old who had been watching the road for a week, channels running full. "Shaft 2 is the strongest it's been since we dug it." "Good," she said. "I fixed the grate on section 7. It was running a little fast. Thought you'd want to know." She looked at him. He was looking at Clem's bridle with extreme focus. "That's good work, Jesse," she said. He nodded with the studied indifference of someone who is pleased and is managing it poorly. She walked up to the house. Colton was on the porch. Of course he was. He'd probably been there for the past hour, moving inside and outside with whatever reason he'd given himself for going back and forth, which was fine because she'd ridden the last 5 miles faster than the road required. He looked at her. She stopped at the base of the steps. They were standing exactly where they'd stood that first day, in the same positions, the same geometry, her at the bottom, him on the porch, the valley spread out around them, the ranch behind him. "Everything all right," he said. "Everything's all right?" she said. And for once it mostly was. Not perfectly, nothing was perfectly all right. And anything that presented itself as perfectly all right deserved a second look, but genuinely, measurably, in the ways that mattered. The water was running, the land was theirs, the case was decided, and the people who'd tried to take it had run into something they hadn't expected when they looked at Blackstone Ranch and saw only what was easy to take. They'd seen the struggle and the drought and the failing wells and a rancher who was running out of time and options, and they'd thought they understood what they were looking at. They'd missed the woman who read what didn't fit. There is something particular about the people who walk into broken things and see not the breakage but the structure underneath it, the underlying shape that still holds, the resource that hasn't been found, the solution that requires looking in a direction everyone else has already decided isn't worth looking. These people are not always easy to be around. They don't always finish what they start. They move toward problems with an appetite that can seem, to people who prefer certainty, like recklessness. But in the places where the water has dried up and the paperwork is stacked against you, and the most powerful man in the valley has decided your land should be his in those places, the person who asks where the water actually went and goes to look for the answer and writes down what she finds, that person is not a complication. That person is the reason things survive. Elara Voss never became a legend. She didn't want to be one. Legends are stories that have stopped moving, and she was not done moving. She built 3 more water systems in the following decade, in 3 different territories, and she argued in front of 2 more territorial courts and 1 federal hearing, and she was wrong about things and right about more things, and never once claimed to be certain about anything she wasn't certain about. She came back to Blackstone Ranch between jobs, and then more often, and then it was simply where she came back to, which is not the same as never leaving, but which is its own kind of staying. Jesse became in time the kind of man who could read a slope and a soil sample and tell you things about water that he'd learned from watching someone pay attention. He taught the same things to others, eventually, in the same way she'd taught him, by pointing at things until people started seeing them. Dutch never said much about any of it. He maintained the channel and the rotation and the way of things at Blackstone Ranch, with the particular dedication of a man who has decided that something is worth maintaining. And that was enough, and he knew it was enough, and that was its own kind of wisdom. And Colton Hayes, who had once been a man standing on a porch, holding cold coffee, and watching a woman drag her trunk across the drive, and thinking the wrong thing about her, Colton Hayes learned, slowly and imperfectly, and with more resistance than he would have admitted, that the strongest thing he ever did was not the cattle runs, or the brutal winters, or the legal fight, though all of those cost him something real. The strongest thing he ever did was open the door, each time, when she came back. Because, in the end, that is what survival requires of us, not just the ability to hold on, but the willingness to let in the thing we didn't expect, the person who sees differently, the solution that doesn't look like a solution until it is. The water was there, all along, running deep and dark beneath the cracked ground of Red Hollow Valley, waiting for someone who knew where to look. All it needed was someone who refused to stop looking.